"Take the pen away from her," Grant said into the microphone. "She doesn't understand what she's signing." The crowd inside the old packing house went quiet. A moment earlier, 200 guests had been laughing beneath amber lights. Now every face had turned toward me. I sat at the head table, with my arthritic fingers beside a leather folder, while my son-in-law stood over my shoulder, as if I were a child who had wandered into traffic. He smiled for the audience. "You've done enough, Evelyn," he said gently. "Let the people who still understand the business handle it." That sentence was meant to humiliate me. It was also the sentence I had spent 6 weeks waiting to hear. I looked down at the retirement papers, then I looked at Grant and let my mouth tremble just enough to satisfy him. "All right," I said, "but if you're taking control, you should sign the harvest certification too." His smile widened. He had no idea that a state inspection truck was already turning through the south gate. "Before I tell you how my family reached that table, tell me where you're listening from. And if someone has ever mistaken your age for weakness, stay with me. Some people do not realize they are standing on poisoned ground until the roots begin to speak. My name is Evelyn Mercer. I was 69 that autumn, and for most of my adult life I measured time by bloom, frost, and harvest. My late husband, Daniel, and I built Mercer Ridge orchards outside Hood River, Oregon, on land most people considered useless. We planted pears anyway, Bartlett's, Angus, and a small block of camas trees Daniel insisted would outlive us both. For 38 years, I worked as an agricultural chemist while helping run the orchard. I studied soil composition, fertilizer drift, fungal pressure, water quality, and the quiet ways one careless decision could travel through an entire growing system. A tree rarely dies on the day it is harmed. It carries the injury in its roots long before the leaves confess it. I should have remembered that families can do the same. 6 weeks before the festival, I walked the eastern slope just after sunrise. The air smelled of damp earth and river fog. Overnight moisture clung to the fruit, turning each pear silver in the early light. I had not planned to inspect that block. Grant had repeatedly told me to stop wandering the steep rows alone because of my hands and my left knee. He called it concern. I called it a fence being built one polite board at a time. That morning I ignored him. Halfway down row 17, I noticed the first damaged tree. The outer edges of several leaves had browned, but not in the scattered pattern of heat stress. The discoloration formed a narrow, even band, almost as if someone had dipped the leaves into weak acid. A few young pears were misshapen near the stem. The grass beneath the emitters had yellowed in circles no wider than dinner plates. I crouched and pressed 2 fingers into the soil. Too slick, not wet, slick, healthy orchard soil crumbles even when damp. This soil held together with a faint greasy sheen, and when I rubbed it between my fingers, a metallic smell rose through the sweetness of fallen fruit. I took out my pocket notebook. Good science begins by resisting the answer you fear most. I wrote down the row number, temperature, recent irrigation cycle, wind direction, and distance from the nearest service road. Then I heard tires on gravel. Grant's white utility vehicle stopped at the top of the row. He climbed out wearing polished boots that had never known a full season of mud. At 43, he was handsome in the careful way that made strangers trust him quickly. After a devastating freeze 3 years earlier, he renegotiated loans and secured contracts while the rest of us counted dead buds. For that, I had once been grateful. "What are you doing down here?" he called. Looking at the leaves, he walked toward me, patient but tight. "You promised Claire you wouldn't come out alone. I promised your wife I'd carry my phone. You left it in the kitchen. I checked my jacket pocket. Empty. That unsettled me. I remembered setting it beside my keys. But memory is not evidence, especially when people are waiting for you to doubt yourself." Grant crouched beside me and glanced at the damaged leaves. "Mineral burn," he said. "The county flushed an old line last week, probably stirred up sediment. The county line doesn't feed this block. They changed the junction in July. No one told me. That's because you're not handling infrastructure anymore." The words were quiet, almost kind. He stood and held out his hand. I ignored it and rose on my own, slower than I would have liked. "I want the water report," I said. "I'll have Nolan send it today." Grant gave a small laugh. "Of course." Then he snapped one of the damaged leaves from the branch and folded it into his palm. "You worry too much, Evelyn. I used to be paid for that. His smile remained, but something behind it hardened. He walked me toward the house, keeping one hand near my elbow without touching me. From a distance, anyone watching would have seen a devoted son-in-law helping an aging widow across uneven ground. At lunch, Nolan said the county had disturbed sediment. Claire told me Grant was under enormous pressure and asked me not to interrogate him over every yellow leaf. Sophie, my 16-year-old granddaughter, barely looked up from the camera she carried everywhere. By evening, I almost convinced myself they were right. Almost just before dark, I returned to row 17 alone. I brought gloves, a flashlight, and the old brass filter wrench Daniel had kept above the pump controls. The irrigation line was off. I knelt beside the nearest filter housing and loosened the cap. Water dribbled onto the grass. Inside, the mesh screen was coated with a thin crust of blue-gray crystals. I scraped one onto my glove. It caught the flashlight beam and shone like ground metal. Then I lifted it toward my face. The smell was faint, bitter, and unmistakably artificial. Whatever had entered our water had not come from county sediment. And someone in my family already knew it was there. I carried the filter screen back to the equipment barn inside an old glass canning jar. The crystals clung to the mesh even after I rinsed it with distilled water. Under the workbench lamp, they looked almost beautiful blue-gray flecks arranged along the wire like frost. Beauty has fooled more people than poison ever has. I locked the jar inside a metal cabinet and wrote the date in my notebook. September 3, row 17, Eastern Irrigation Block. Then I stood alone in the barn and listened to the building settle around me. The place still smelled like Daniel, motor oil, sawdust, wintergreen liniment. He had been gone 6 years, but grief does not obey calendars. It hides in ordinary things and waits for you to touch them. Daniel Mercer was not a sentimental man. He believed love was best expressed through repaired fences and full fuel tanks. When we bought the first 80 acres in 1982, he spent every dollar we had on trees too young to bear fruit and a tractor too old to start without prayer. The land had been neglected for decades. The soil was compacted. The irrigation ditch leaked. Half the local growers expected us to fail before the second winter. We nearly did. I worked weekdays at a regional agricultural laboratory while Daniel managed the orchard. At night, we tested soil at the kitchen table after Nolan and Claire had gone to bed. We argued over calcium ratios, rootstock, and whether another loan would save us or bury us. Those years cost our children more than I understood at the time. Nolan learned to drive a tractor before he learned to shave. Claire spent school vacations sorting fruit in the packing shed, while her friends went to the lake. We called it building something for them. They sometimes experienced it as being drafted into our dream. Nolan carried that resentment longer than Claire did. He was bright, mechanical, and restless. At 17, he told Daniel he did not want to spend his life repairing pumps in a valley where everyone knew what his grandfather had planted. Daniel answered badly. "No one is forcing you to inherit anything," he said. "But don't expect to inherit what you refuse to help build." Nolan left the room and did not speak to him for 3 weeks. I told myself they would repair the damage. Fathers and sons often do. Then seasons passed. Pride hardened, and neither man learned how to apologize without first defending himself. Nolan eventually stayed. That was the cruel part. He married young, divorced badly, and returned to Mercer Ridge with debt and a bitterness he wore like an old coat. He became indispensable to the operation, but never fully believed the orchard belonged to him. Claire was different. She left Oregon, studied hospitality management, and worked at resorts in California. She came home after Daniel's first heart attack, bringing Grant with her. Grant arrived during the worst year our family had seen. A late freeze destroyed nearly 70% of the blossoms. Our insurer disputed part of the claim. 2 export buyers canceled contracts within the same week. Daniel was recovering from surgery and pretending he could still climb ladders. Grant stepped into the confusion with spreadsheets, polished shoes, and an answer for everything. He renegotiated a line of credit. He convinced a regional grocery chain to accept smaller fruit for a private label program. He turned the old tasting room into a profitable tourist business Claire could manage. Most importantly, He made my daughter laugh during a year when our house had forgotten how. I trusted him because he did not ask to be trusted. He worked. That was what I told myself. The next morning I found Nolan in the machinery shed, replacing a cracked hydraulic hose. He was 45, broad through the shoulders, with Daniel's heavy brow and my habit of looking away when angry. "I need the county water report," I said. He kept his eyes on the fitting. "Grant said he'd send it. He hasn't. It's been one night. I want the raw report, not a summary." Nolan set down his wrench. "Mom, this is exactly what Claire was talking about." "What did Claire say?" "That you've been circling every decision like we're trying to steal the place." The words landed harder because he spoke them without cruelty. "I found residue in the eastern filter. Sediment. It isn't sediment, you tested it." "Not yet, then you don't know. I know what natural mineral deposits look like." Nolan wiped his hands on a rag. "You also haven't worked in a lab for 12 years. Science changes, but chemistry does not." I almost said it. Instead, I watched the tendon in his jaw tighten. "Did you authorize any treatment in row 17? I asked. "No, did Grant? He handles crop inputs now. That wasn't my question." Nolan folded the rag carefully. "Buying time. No treatment I know about." The answer was technically clean and emotionally filthy. Before I could press him, Grant entered carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. He handed one to Nolan and offered the other to me. "Decaf," he said. "Claire says caffeine is making your hands worse." I did not take it. "The report," I said. "Already printed." He produced a folder and laid it on the workbench. The top page bore the county utility seal. The mineral analysis showed slightly elevated iron and manganese. Nothing more. Grant tapped the figures. "Exactly what I told you." I read the collection date, August 14. "Where was this sample taken?" "The Eastern Junction. There are 3 Eastern Junctions." He paused for less than a second. "Near the lower pump." "Which lower pump?" His expression softened, not with uncertainty but pity. "Evelyn, maybe we should sit down." I hated the way he used my name when he wanted to make resistance look unreasonable. "I'm standing perfectly well." Grant exchanged a glance with Nolan. "There are conversations that end before anyone speaks." That glance was one of them. Later that afternoon, Claire came to the house with groceries I had not requested. She placed them in my refrigerator, moved my coffee to a lower shelf, and asked whether I had taken my blood pressure medication. "I take it every morning. You called me twice last week to ask what day it was." I called because the festival printer had 2 different dates on the proofs. "That isn't how you described it." Her voice was gentle, but her hands kept rearranging things in my kitchen. I caught her wrist. "Claire, look at me." She did. "Do you believe I'm losing my mind?" Her face changed before she answered. "I think you're grieving. I think you're tired, and I think you've spent so long being the person everyone depends on that you don't know how to let anyone help you." It was a loving answer that made it more dangerous. After she left, I returned to the office and opened the county report again. The signature line at the bottom listed the responsible orchard representative. Evelyn Mercer. My name had been written in neat blue ink. I held the page beneath the desk lamp and studied the slant of the capital E, the narrow loop in the L, and the hard downward stroke at the end. It resembled my signature well enough to fool a stranger. But I had signed my name tens of thousands of times. The woman who signed that report was not me. I did not confront anyone about the forged signature. Not that night. The old version of me would have marched into Grant's office, slapped the report onto his desk, and demanded an explanation before he had time to invent one. But age had taught me something pride never could. The first person to reveal what they know usually gives away more than they receive. I placed the report in the bottom drawer of Daniel's desk and locked it. Then I made a photocopy. The original stayed hidden beneath a stack of irrigation easements from the 1990s. The copy went into a manila envelope inside my car, tucked under the spare tire, where no one in the family had reason to look. The following morning, I discovered my car keys were gone. I searched the ceramic bowl by the kitchen door, the pocket of my raincoat, and the narrow drawer where Daniel used to keep loose bolts and receipts. Nothing. When I entered the office, Grant was seated behind the desk that had once belonged to my husband. My keys rested beside his laptop. "What are those doing here?" I asked. Grant looked up with the patient expression of a man interrupted by someone harmless. Claire found them in the refrigerator. I stared at him. She found my car keys in the refrigerator. That's what she said. Where in the refrigerator? He closed the laptop. Does it matter? It matters to me. Grant leaned back. Evelyn, no one is accusing you of anything. We're concerned. Concern had become his favorite tool. He wrapped every insult in it. I reached for the keys, but he placed his hand over them. Let Nolan drive you for a while. No, just until after the festival. Move your hand. His eyes stayed on mine. For one brief second, the kindness left his face. What remained was not anger. It was calculation. Then Nolan entered carrying a box of replacement valves. He stopped when he saw us. Grant immediately softened. Tell your mother what you told me about the West Service Road. Nolan set down the box. What about it? The delivery truck last week. Nolan rubbed the back of his neck. You pulled out in front of it. I did not. The driver had to brake. He was coming around a blind curve too fast, Mom. It doesn't matter whose fault it was. It matters if you're using it to take my keys. Nolan exhaled through his nose. Nobody's taking anything. We're asking you to slow down. Grant slid the keys into his desk drawer. The lock clicked. That sound was small, but it changed the room. Daniel and I had built Mercer Ridge with no formal titles between us. We disagreed over nearly everything: planting density, fertilizer costs, whether visitors should be allowed beyond the tasting room, but neither of us ever locked the other out. I looked at Nolan. You're allowing this? His face tightened. We're trying to keep you safe. No, you're teaching him how far he can go. Grant stood. That's enough. The authority in his voice surprised all three of us. He seemed to realize it too, because he lowered his volume. You're exhausted. We all are. Let's not turn a temporary precaution into a family war. I left without the keys. By noon, the fences had moved again. My access code to the chemical storage building no longer worked. The digital panel flashed red when I entered the number I had used for 7 years. Mateo Ruiz was repairing an irrigation controller nearby. He watched me try twice before walking over. System update, he said quietly. Who requested it? He glanced toward the packing house. Mr. Kessler, did he change everyone's code? Mateo adjusted the screwdriver in his hand. I don't know. It was a lie, but not an aggressive one. Fear makes people lie softly. Mateo had worked at Mercer Ridge since he was 19. His father picked fruit here before that. He understood pumps, valves, and pressure systems better than most engineers with framed degrees. Try yours, I said. He hesitated. Mrs. Mercer, try it. Mateo entered 6 digits. The lock released. He stepped back as though the open door might accuse him. My access is for repairs and mine. I was told you wouldn't need to go inside anymore. The words came out barely above a whisper. I looked past him into the storage room. The shelves nearest the entrance held approved fertilizers, cleaning concentrates, and labeled pest control products. At the rear, a new gray partition had been installed from floor to ceiling. That wall wasn't there last month. Mateo's eyes shifted away. It's a secure inventory section. For what? You should ask Mr. Kessler. I am asking you. He tightened his lips. Mateo wanted his contractor's license. Grant had written one of the recommendation letters required by the state board, and everyone on the property knew it. A man does not have to threaten your family when he holds your future in a file cabinet. I stepped away from the door. You didn't see me try the code. Relief passed over his face, followed quickly by shame. No, ma'am. That afternoon I walked the northern boundary instead of returning home. The orchard stretched over rolling ground toward a line of cottonwood trees. Beyond them lay the county road and a narrow creek that supplied several smaller farms downstream. Daniel used to say fences were useful only when everyone agreed what they protected. Otherwise, they became declarations of ownership near the eastern well. I found a new declaration. A metal sign had been bolted to the chain-link gate. Restricted access, off-force personal, only property managed by Costco, Renewable Holdings. I read it twice. Mercer Ridge owned that well. Daniel and I had paid to drill it 22 years earlier, after 2 dry summers nearly destroyed the Anjou block. The water rights were attached to our land and protected by an agreement I had personally reviewed. I had never heard of Cascade Renewable Holdings. The gate had a new padlock, a heavy commercial model, bright silver against the old rusted chain. I crouched beside the post and examined the ground. Fresh tire impressions crossed the mud, wide rear tread, likely a tanker or service truck, The tracks continued toward the pump house, then disappeared over gravel. On the lower hinge, I noticed a smear of pale blue residue. I touched it with the corner of a tissue. The color matched the crystals from row 17. A truck approached behind me. I folded the tissue and slipped it into my pocket before Grant's utility vehicle stopped beside the gate. He lowered the window. "You shouldn't be this far out alone. I was looking at our well. It's being serviced by Cascade Renewable Holdings?" His expression did not change, but both hands settled on the steering wheel. "They're an environmental consulting company. Why is an environmental consultant managing property it doesn't own?" "Because our insurers required additional oversight." "Which insurer?" Grant smiled faintly. "You see, this is the problem. Every operational decision becomes an interrogation. Then answer one question and save us both the trouble." He looked at the sign, then back at me. "I'll explain everything after the festival. That's 6 weeks away. We've managed without your approval before." The sentence came too easily. Grant unlocked the passenger door. "Get in, Claire is worried." I remained beside the gate. Beyond him, through the windshield, I saw a folder on the passenger seat. A typed heading was visible beneath the clear plastic cover. "Mercer Ridge Water Asset Transfer. Preliminary Terms." Grant followed my gaze. He reached over and turned the folder face down. Then he smiled again. This time, neither of us pretended it was kindness. Grant drove away. Without offering me a ride again, I waited until his utility vehicle disappeared beyond the cottonwoods, then removed the folded tissue from my pocket. The blue residue had left a faint powdery mark against the white paper. I sealed it inside one of the small evidence envelopes I still kept in Daniel's workshop. Calling it evidence would have been premature. A stain was not a crime. A forged signature was not proof of poisoning. Even the water transfer folder might have contained nothing more sinister than a refinancing proposal. But uncertainty should lead to testing, not surrender. The next morning, I rose before 5. Without my car keys, I could not drive to an independent laboratory without alerting the family. Grant had also begun watching the household account, supposedly to help me avoid duplicate payments. Any large charge would invite questions. Fortunately, Mercer Ridge still had a laboratory of its own. It was not much by modern standards, a narrow room behind the old grading shed, with a stained workbench, a ventilation hood, and metal cabinets, filled with instruments too outdated for commercial certification. Daniel had wanted to convert it into storage years ago. I refused. "Old tools aren't useless," I told him. "They just stop impressing people." I entered through the side door, while the packing crew gathered for their morning assignments. The blue-gray crystals from the filter waited inside the canning jar where I had left them. I photographed the jar beside a handwritten date card, then put on gloves and divided the material into 3 samples. The first went beneath a small inspection microscope. The particles were irregular and layered. Natural iron deposits tended to be reddish or brown, while manganese often appeared nearly black. These crystals had a pale blue cast and a waxy edge that suggested a formulated product rather than a mineral precipitate. The second sample dissolved slowly in distilled water. I checked the pH, far too acidic for ordinary sediment from our well. The third sample went through a basic colorimetric screening process. The test could not identify a commercial compound with legal certainty, but it could indicate chemical families. I added the reagent 1 drop at a time. At first nothing happened. Then the liquid changed from clear to a cloudy violet. I stared at the vial. Years earlier, I had worked on residue studies involving plant growth regulators. Most were safe when properly licensed and applied. Others were restricted because they persisted in soil, entered waterways, or altered fruit development in ways consumers could not detect by sight. The violet results suggested the presence of a synthetic growth regulator from a family that had no place in a certified organic orchard. I repeated the test. The same color appeared. A sound came from the corridor. I covered the vials with an empty cardboard tray, just as the laboratory door opened. Sophie stood there with her camera hanging from a strap around her neck. She looked at the gloves, the microscope, and the cardboard tray. "Are you making poison? At my age, poison is too much cleanup." She did not laugh. Sophie had Claire's dark hair and Daniel's habit of watching before speaking. At 16, she had reached the age when adults began treating her silence as absence. "What are you doing here?" I asked. "Dad said I could film the old buildings before they renovate them." "What renovation?" She shrugged. "He wants to turn this wing into offices after the festival." That was the first I had heard of it. "Did he say when?" Soon her eyes settled on the canning jar. "What's that?" "Something from an irrigation filter. Is it bad?" "I don't know yet." That answer disappointed her. Young people often mistake caution for ignorance because the loudest adults in their lives rarely admit uncertainty. Sophie stepped inside and lowered her voice. "Dad told Mom you're trying to prove he's poisoning the trees." I remained still. "When did he say that?" "Last night." "Who else was there?" "Uncle Nolan." "And what did Nolan say?" "He said you always need something to be wrong." The sentence hurt more than I allowed my face to show. Sophie adjusted the focus ring on her camera. "I don't think that's true." "Why not?" "Because when something is wrong, everyone tells you to stop looking at it." Before I could answer, Grant called her name from the grading shed. She flinched. "Don't tell him I was in here." "Why?" "He doesn't like me filming work stuff." Grant called again. Closer this time. Sophie slipped through the side door. I waited several seconds, then uncovered the test vials. I poured the used solutions into the proper waste container, cleaned the equipment, and placed the remaining solid samples into separate envelopes. One would stay hidden at the orchard. One would eventually go to an independent laboratory. The third would remain untouched as a control. I had just locked the cabinet when Grant entered. His gaze traveled across the room. "You're up early, so are you." I was looking for Sophie. She was photographing the old shed. He smiled without warmth. "She's in a phase." "What phase is that?" "Believing a camera makes her invisible." He walked to the workbench and ran one finger through a clean patch beside the microscope. "You've been testing something." There was no point denying it. I tested the residue from row 17, and the screening indicates a synthetic growth regulator. Grant's eyebrows rose, but only slightly, with equipment older than my marriage. "Old glassware does not invent reactions." "No, but contaminated glassware does." The test was repeated. He folded his arms. "All right, let's assume you detected something. We had drift reported from the Jensen property 2 weeks ago. They sprayed their west block in high wind. It could have crossed the boundary. The Jensen orchard is uphill and nearly a mile away. Wind does not respect property lines. It also doesn't coat the inside of a closed irrigation filter." That stopped him, only for a moment. Then Grant nodded as if I had helped him solve the problem. "Backflow contamination from where?" "A contractor may have connected a treatment tank incorrectly during maintenance." "Which contractor?" "I'll review the work orders. Let me see them when I find the relevant one." His explanation was possible. That was what made Grant dangerous. He did not offer lies that collapsed at first touch. He built them with enough truth to survive casual inspection. "You should close this room," he said. "Some of these reagents are probably unstable. They're properly stored. You could expose yourself to something." "I spent 38 years avoiding that. And now you forget where you put your keys." There it was, not an accusation, a reminder of the story he was building around me. Grant left the laboratory and closed the door softly behind him. For the rest of the morning, I reviewed spray logs, weather records, and maintenance invoices. The Jensen orchard had sprayed a permitted fungicide, not a growth regulator. Wind direction that day had been southeast, away from Mercer Ridge. There was no contractor work order involving the eastern irrigation block. At noon, I went to the office to check the wastebasket beneath the document scanner. Grant had a habit of printing shipping records, scanning them, and discarding the originals. Most of the pages were harmless: cardboard orders, diesel receipts, replacement bearings. Near the bottom, I found half of a torn adhesive label. The product description had been ripped away, but the manufacturer's code remained visible. I knew that prefix. It belonged to the same chemical family that had turned my test vial violet. The delivery address was Mercer Ridge Orchards. The receiver's signature consisted of one initial and a last name, G. Kessler, and the delivery date was 3 months before Grant claimed any contamination had occurred. I made the mistake of confronting Grant the next morning. Not because I lacked patience, because the label carried his signature. There are moments when evidence stops feeling like information and begins feeling like a personal insult. I had spent 3 days allowing my family to speak around me as if I were a failing appliance. Then I found proof that Grant had accepted delivery of the same chemical he claimed had drifted in from another orchard. My judgment narrowed. I called Claire and Nolan to the office before breakfast. Grant arrived last, still fastening the cuff of his shirt, looking mildly inconvenienced rather than concerned. I placed the torn shipping label on Daniel's desk. "Explain this." Claire remained standing near the doorway. Nolan leaned against a filing cabinet with his arms crossed. Grant picked up the label and studied it. "Where did you find this?" "In the wastebasket. You searched my trash?" "I searched company records discarded in a company office." His eyes moved toward Claire. That small glance was enough to make me sound unreasonable before he said a word. I pointed to the manufacturer's prefix. "This code belongs to a restricted family of growth regulators." The same chemical family appeared in residue from our irrigation filter. Nolan looked at Grant. "Is that true?" Grant set the label down. "We ordered a trial product for a neighboring conventional grower." "Why was it delivered here?" I asked. "Because we share freight service. We do not store chemicals for neighboring orchards." "It was never stored. You signed for it." "Yes." "Where did it go?" "To the carrier, who collected it the same afternoon." "Show me the return record." Grant's jaw shifted. "I don't keep personal copies of every freight correction." "Then call the carrier right now." "Yes." Claire stepped forward. "Mom, stop." I turned to her. "Your husband signed for a restricted chemical that later appeared in our irrigation system. You haven't proven it's the same product." "I've proven enough to ask questions." "No," Grant said quietly. "You've proven that an old laboratory test changed color." The dismissal in his voice pulled me another step away from reason. "I also found my forged signature on a county water report." The room changed. Nolan straightened. Claire looked at Grant, then back at me. "What report?" she asked. I opened Daniel's bottom drawer. The original was gone. For a second, I simply stared at the empty space beneath the irrigation easements. I lifted the folders, checked the rear of the drawer, and pulled it open as far as the runners allowed. "Nothing." Grant watched me search. "I put it here," I said. "Put what there?" Nolan asked. "The water analysis. Someone signed my name." Claire's shoulders lowered in weary disappointment. "Mom, don't use that tone with me." "What tone?" "The one people use when they've already decided what they're seeing." Grant walked around the desk. "Maybe you moved it." "I did not. You said you made a copy." "It's in my car." The moment the words left my mouth, I remembered that Grant still had my keys. He reached into his pocket and placed them on the desk. "Go get it." His confidence should have warned me. I took the keys and crossed the yard to my car. Claire and Nolan followed, while Grant remained behind at first, giving the impression that he had nothing to fear. I opened the trunk, lifted the floor panel, and reached beneath the spare tire. The envelope was gone. In its place sat a folded roadside emergency blanket I had never purchased. Nolan closed his eyes. "I put it there," I said. The copy was in a brown envelope. Grant had followed us outside. He stopped several feet away. "Evelyn, did anyone actually see this report?" "I saw it." "That's not what I asked." I turned on him. "You took it." Claire recoiled as if I had struck him. Grant did not defend himself. He looked at my children with an expression of embarrassment on my behalf. That was when I understood. I had walked into a room he had prepared long before I arrived. He spoke gently. "Claire, maybe now is the time." "No," she said. Nolan looked between them. "Time for what?" Grant hesitated just enough to appear reluctant. Over the next 10 minutes, my family presented the case against my mind. The stove burner I had supposedly left on. The morning I called Claire twice to confirm the date. The car incident on the West Service Road. A payroll check I signed on the wrong line. Medication found beside the sink after I said I had taken it. Each event contained a grain of truth. I had left a burner on low after Daniel's memorial dinner, though Claire had been the last person making tea. I had called twice because the festival printer sent conflicting schedules. I signed the payroll check in the endorsement box because Nolan distracted me with a broken compressor. The medication disturbed me most. "I took that pill," I said. Grant shook his head. "Claire found it untouched. Then someone put another one there." Silence followed. The accusation sounded irrational even to me. Claire began to cry. Do you hear yourself? I hear myself perfectly. You're accusing us of moving your belongings, forging your name, stealing papers, and planting medication. I'm accusing Grant. He is my husband, and I am your mother. That doesn't make you incapable of being wrong. Nolan stepped between us. We need to lower our voices. No, I said. We need to raise the right questions. Grant rested both palms on the car roof. I've been trying to protect your dignity. The sentence was delivered with practiced sorrow. What dignity? I asked. The kind where you lock me out of my own buildings? The kind where we don't discuss your decline in front of employees. My decline, he finally named it. Claire wiped her cheek. We made an appointment. With whom? A neurologist in Portland. I did not authorize that. It's only an evaluation, she said. Please, for us. Grant removed a folded card from his wallet and handed it to me. The physician's name was Dr. Calvin Reese. The appointment was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 10 in the morning. I had met Reese once before at a Growers Association dinner. Grant had introduced him as an investor in one of his agricultural technology ventures. That connection sharpened the edges of my anger. You chose a doctor who does business with Grant. Grant's face stayed calm. Calvin invested in a water monitoring startup years ago. That has nothing to do with his medical judgment. You expect me to believe that? Nolan struck the side of the car with his palm. Enough, Mom. He had never spoken to me that way. His voice cracked afterward, but the damage had already landed. I am tired of watching you make enemies out of everyone trying to help. I looked at my son and saw the boy who had once waited beside the packing shed for a father too busy to attend his school concert. I had spent years believing hard work could compensate for absence. It could not. Grant knew where every old wound was buried. He had simply learned where to press. I folded the appointment card and placed it in my pocket. All right, I said. Claire looked startled. You'll go? Yes. Grant's shoulders relaxed. He thought I had surrendered. I had not. But as they walked back toward the office, I remained beside my open trunk, staring at the empty space beneath the spare tire. Grant had removed both copies of the report without leaving a trace. He knew where I hid things, and now he knew I was investigating him. That night, I stopped trying to prove I was right. Grant had taken the report, searched my car, and turned my own children into witnesses against me. Every direct accusation gave him another opportunity to look patient while I looked unstable. So I changed the role I was playing. The next morning, I came downstairs wearing the same cardigan I had worn the day before. I left one button fastened through the wrong hole. At breakfast, I asked Claire whether the festival was next week. It's more than a month away, she said carefully. I frowned as though embarrassed. Of course it is. Grant looked up from his tablet. I saw relief move through his face before concern replaced it. That was the first lesson of my surrender. People see what they are hoping to see. I let Claire drive me to the neurology appointment in Portland. Grant sat in the front passenger seat, answering questions directed at me before I could open my mouth. How has she been sleeping? Dr. Calvin Reese asked, poorly. Grant said the doctor looked at me. Is that true? Some nights, any confusion when waking. Grant shifted in his chair. I lowered my gaze. Sometimes I need a moment. That answer was truthful enough. Everyone needs a moment when they wake. Reese entered it into his notes, as if I had confessed to wandering through the orchard in my nightgown. He administered a brief cognitive screening. I knew the design, orientation, recall, attention, language, spatial reasoning. I could have passed it cleanly. Instead, I missed one word during delayed recall and reversed two numbers when repeating a sequence backward. I did well enough to avoid an immediate diagnosis, but poorly enough to justify further observation. Reese removed his glasses. At this stage, I would not call what I'm seeing dementia. Claire released a breath, however, he continued. Stress, grief, sleep disruption, medication interactions, and early cognitive changes can overlap. I recommend reducing complex responsibilities until we have a clearer picture. Grant nodded solemnly. What kind of responsibilities? Financial approvals, driving heavy equipment, chemical handling, anything where a lapse could create risk. Every area he listed removed another piece of my authority. I looked at Reese. Do you advise that for every patient who misses one word? His fingers paused above the keyboard. No, I consider the broader pattern reported by the family. The broader pattern Grant had built. Outside the clinic, Claire hugged me in the parking garage. I'm proud of you for coming. The tenderness in her voice nearly broke my resolve. I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to pull the shipping label from my purse and make her see the trap closing around us. But she was not ready to see it. Worse, she would tell Grant. So I leaned against her shoulder and said, "Perhaps I have been holding on too tightly." Grant stood a few feet away. He tried not to smile. On the drive home, I apologized. I told them Daniel's death had left me afraid of becoming unnecessary. I said I had confused control with responsibility. I admitted that finding damaged leaves had frightened me, and that I might have allowed old professional instincts to turn into suspicion. Claire cried quietly as she drove. Grant reached back between the seats and squeezed my hand. "You'll always have a place here," he said. "A place. Not authority, not ownership, a place." "I know," I whispered. By the time we reached Mercer Ridge, he believed the fight was over. Over the next week, I became exactly the woman he needed me to be. I misplaced my reading glasses where Claire could find them. I asked Nolan to remind me how to reset the old irrigation clock, though I had installed it myself. When Grant explained the export schedule at a family meeting, I nodded without challenging a single figure. I even thanked him for carrying burdens that had become too complicated for me. Each performance costs something. Pretending weakness is not harmless when the people you love begin treating it as truth. Nolan stopped asking my opinion about equipment repairs. Claire began cutting my food at dinner when my hands hurt. Employees lowered their voices around me, as if confusion might be contagious. Grant restored some of my privileges because he no longer saw them as dangerous. He returned my car keys, though Claire asked me not to drive beyond town. He gave me access to the office again. Most importantly, he stopped hiding his confidence. He took calls with the door half open. He left folders on the conference table. He discussed restructuring costs in front of me, because he assumed the language would move too quickly for my aging mind. I listened. One phrase appeared repeatedly: operational continuity. Grant used it when speaking to bankers, lawyers, and someone named Wesley from Cascade Renewable Holdings. "If Evelyn's evaluation supports operational continuity, we can move before the end of harvest," he said during one call. I sat in the adjoining room arranging old invoices into meaningless piles. He lowered his voice for the rest, but I heard enough. A medical evaluation was not merely protecting him from my interference. It was part of a deadline. That afternoon I began a new notebook. Grant had already searched for my written records, so I did not record names, dates, or accusations. I wrote soil formulas, spray ratios, and weather observations. To anyone else, the pages looked like the wandering notes of a retired chemist, unable to release the past. But I used the periodic table as a cipher. Grant became gallium, element 31. Claire was chlorine. 17. Nolan was nitrogen 7. Each chemical symbol led to a number, and each number corresponded to a page in Daniel's old orchard ledger, where I stored the real meaning in ordinary crop notes. It was cumbersome. It was also mine. 3 days after the appointment, I sat on the porch while Grant and Claire left for a dinner in town. Nolan was repairing a forklift near the packing shed. The evening workers had gone home. Matteau crossed the yard carrying a tool case. He did not look toward me until he reached the steps. "Mrs. Mercer," he said loudly, "I fixed the kitchen pressure problem." There had been no kitchen pressure problem. I played along. "Thank you. I'm sorry I forgot calling you." He crouched as if tying his boot. His voice dropped. "The eastern pump ran again last night." "What time?" "Started at 1:58, stopped at 3:12. The control log says it never turned on." I kept my eyes on the orchard. Could the sensor be faulty? "No, ma'am, pressure doesn't lie." That sounded like Daniel. "Why are you telling me?" Matteo's hand tightened around his shoelace. "Because there's a second pipe beneath the main line. It isn't on any Mercer Ridge plan I've seen. Where does it go?" "From the restricted storage room to the eastern well." A truck engine started near the office. Matteo stood quickly. Before walking away, he slipped a small brass fitting onto the porch beside my chair. Its inner threads were stained with the same blue-gray residue I had found in row 17. On one side, stamped into the metal, was the installation date. It had been fitted 2 months before. Grant claimed the contamination came from a neighboring farm. I did not ask Matteo to explain the pipe again. Fear had already cost him enough. I picked up the brass fitting after he crossed the yard and wrapped it in a clean cotton handkerchief. The blue-gray stain inside the threads was darker than the residue from row 17, which meant the fitting had likely been closer to the source. It was our first physical link between the restricted storage room and the eastern well. It was also nearly useless in court. Matteo had removed it without documenting where it came from. I had handled it without witnesses. Grant could claim the fitting belonged to another system, had been contaminated later, or had never been installed at Mercer Ridge at all. Good evidence does not merely tell the truth, it survives the lies told against it. The following morning, I asked Claire to drive me into town. To the pharmacy, she asked. The county extension office. Her expression tightened. Why? I want some pamphlets about arthritis-friendly gardening. It was humiliating how quickly she believed me. Claire dropped me near the entrance and promised to return in an hour. I waited until her car turned the corner, then walked 2 blocks to the Hood River County Water Resources office. Dr. Lena Cho occupied a small room on the 2nd floor overlooking the Columbia River. She had worked in watershed science for more than 25 years and had never learned the social habit of pretending bad news was less serious than it was. She also had reasons not to trust me. 12 years earlier, Lena and I had served on opposing sides of a county irrigation dispute. She believed several orchards were drawing too aggressively from shallow wells during drought. I argued that her initial model underestimated seasonal recharge. I had been partly right, so had she. Neither of us had behaved graciously afterward. When I entered her office, she looked over her glasses. Evelyn Mercer, Lena, you look well, you still lie badly. That almost produced a smile. I placed the wrapped fitting on her desk. I need you to tell me what this residue might be. She did not touch it. Where did it come from? An irrigation line. Which irrigation line? I can't say yet, then I can't help you. You can run a screening, I can run many things. That does not make them admissible, ethical, or wise. I sat across from her. There may be a restricted growth regulator entering the eastern well at Mercer Ridge. Her expression changed, not dramatically. Lena never wasted movement, but she removed her glasses and folded them on the desk. What makes you think that? I described the leaf damage, the filter crystals, the old laboratory screening, the altered pump records, and the secondary pipe Matteo had found. I did not mention his name. Lena listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at the wrapped fitting. Who removed this? I'm protecting that person, then protect them, but don't ask me to pretend this object has a chain of custody. I'm not asking you to prosecute anyone. You will be eventually. She stood and walked to a wall map showing wells, creeks, irrigation districts, and groundwater contours across the valley. Your eastern block sits above fractured basalt, she said. Water does not always move where surface topography suggests. I know, do you? The question carried an old argument inside it. Lena tapped an area below Mercer Ridge. If something is being injected or repeatedly flushed into your eastern well system, it may not remain beneath your land. Depending on depth, pressure, and seasonal draw, it could migrate toward 3 domestic wells and the lower cooperative intake. The room seemed to narrow. How many households? Potentially 19, more if it reaches the creek. I pictured children filling glasses at kitchen sinks. Farm workers washing produce, families who had no idea our orchard might be feeding chemicals into the same water they trusted. What would you need, I asked, to investigate properly? Yes, official access or a credible complaint, sampling from multiple locations, sterile containers, field blanks, recorded collection times, temperature controls, sealed transport, laboratory analysis by certified staff. How soon? Lena gave me a hard look. You are asking the wrong question. What is the right one? How long has it been happening? I thought of the shipping label dated 3 months earlier. At least 8 weeks, possibly longer. She turned back to the map. Then one sample will not answer this. Soil can retain residues, filters can concentrate them, water levels change, we need a pattern. I can get you onto the property legally. I own it, do you control it? That answer remained lodged in my throat. Lena noticed. What exactly is happening in your family? I looked toward the river beyond her window. My son-in-law is trying to have me declared incompetent. And you believe this is connected? I believe he needs me discredited before he transfers control of the orchard. To whom? Cascade Renewable Holdings. Lena moved to her computer. Her fingers struck the keyboard quickly. After several searches, she leaned closer to the screen. There is no active environmental consulting license under that name in Oregon. Grant called them consultants. They may call themselves astronauts. That doesn't put them in orbit. She searched state business records. Cascade Renewable Holdings was incorporated 14 months ago. Registered agent is a law office in Salem. No employees listed, no operating address beyond a mail service. A shell company, possibly. She clicked through another database. Then she stopped. What? Lena enlarged a watershed map and overlaid a series of well permits. Mercer Ridge's eastern well is deeper than I remembered. 420 feet. And this survey marker here? I leaned toward the screen. A red boundary line cut beneath our eastern acreage and extended toward neighboring farms. I've never seen that designation. It was added after a preliminary hydrogeological study last year. Commissioned by whom? The applicant is confidential during the exploratory stage. But what does the designation mean? Lena's face had gone still. It means someone has reason to believe a high-volume aquifer may run beneath your property. The discovery explained why Grant cared about the well, but not why he would risk contaminating it. Unless the contamination was never intended for the deep aquifer. Unless it was meant to damage the orchard above it. Lena printed the map and slid it toward me. I still cannot use your fitting, she said. But I can authorize a routine regional sampling survey if I have evidence of unexplained pressure activity near a shared water zone. I know someone who can document that, then have them do it without trespassing, tampering, or removing another part. Her voice sharpened. And Evelyn, listen carefully. If your suspicions are correct, this is no longer a private family dispute. The moment contamination crosses a property line, every quiet decision becomes someone else's danger. My phone rang. Claire. I had been gone 58 minutes. I folded the map and placed it inside my coat. Before I reached the door, Lena spoke again. There is something else. She had opened the county's automated monitoring archive. A graph filled the screen, showing nighttime pressure changes in wells across the eastern valley. One line rose sharply at 2:03 every morning, then fell shortly after 3. The sensor belonged to a residential well nearly half a mile below Mercer Ridge. Whatever Grant was moving through our system was already affecting water beyond our land. I returned to Mercer Ridge with Lena's map folded beneath my blouse. Claire was waiting beside the extension office, both hands on the steering wheel. She watched me fasten my seatbelt, as though looking for evidence of confusion. Did you find what you needed? She asked. Pamphlets about arthritis. And raised garden beds. The lie came easily. That frightened me. On the drive home, Claire talked about the Harvest Heritage Festival. Vendor permits were behind schedule. Grant had invited an international buyer from Rotterdam and expected local press. Why Rotterdam? I asked. For the export contract. What export contract? Her fingers tightened around the wheel. I thought Grant told you. He tells me many things now, usually after they're decided. Claire sighed. It's bigger than anything we've handled before. How large? Nearly the entire late Anjou crop. That was not an order, it was a wager. Mercer Ridge had never committed so much fruit to one buyer. Frost, storage failure, shipping delays, or a quality dispute could empty our operating reserve. When does it ship? 3 weeks after the festival. And who certified the volume? Grant and Nolan. I turned toward the window. Rows of pear trees passed in disciplined lines, their branches heavy with fruit. From the road they looked healthy. That was the deception of orchards. Damage often moved beneath the surface long, before the canopy showed distress. When we reached the house, Grant's utility vehicle was parked outside the packing shed. A banner hung across the entrance. Mercer Ridge. Growing into the future, I had spent 4 decades learning to distrust slogans. Inside, nearly 30 employees stood between the sorting lines. Grant occupied a raised platform beside Nolan. A projector displayed shipping schedules and refrigerated containers, stacked at a port. Grant smiled when he saw me. Perfect timing. That meant my presence had been planned. I was just announcing the largest international agreement in Mercer Ridge history. Employees applauded. The freeze 3 years earlier had frightened everyone, and a major contract promised steady work through winter. Grant gestured toward the screen. A European hospitality distributor has committed to purchasing 180 truckloads of certified organic anjou pears, with options for 2 additional seasons. The number struck me harder than I expected. 180 truckloads exceeded our reliable organic yield, unless he included fruit from the eastern blocks, the same blocks showing chemical damage. Nolan spoke next. This keeps the packing house open through January. No reduced shifts. The applause grew louder. Grant had tied his contract to the paychecks of every person in the room. Anyone who questioned him would not merely threaten a sale. They would threaten families. He descended from the platform and offered me the microphone. Would you like to say a few words? The old Evelyn would have asked about residue testing and penalties. Grant expected that version. I accepted the microphone with both hands so they would notice the tremor. This is wonderful news, I said. Daniel would have been proud to see the orchard growing. Nolan looked at me sharply. Grant smiled. After the meeting, I followed them into the conference room. Grant closed the door. You handled that beautifully, he said. What happens if the fruit fails residue testing? His smile thinned. It won't. Who signs the grower declaration? A pause. Currently you do, currently? Grant opened a blue folder. The buyer requires continuity of authority through harvest and delivery. Given Dr. Reese's recommendations, the bank and insurer want a temporary operating resolution. He slid the document toward me. The language was polite and broad. It granted Grant authority over production, contracts, accounts, personnel, regulatory communications, and water management, until the family board determined I could resume my duties. There was no end date. This is not temporary, I said. It can be revoked by the board. Yes, the board consisted of me, Claire, Nolan, and Grant. If my vote were removed on medical grounds, Grant needed only one of my children. He already had both. Nolan avoided my eyes. The contract has a delivery guarantee, I said. What is the penalty? Grant answered too quickly. Standard commercial remedies. How much? Nolan rubbed his forehead. Up to $4 million if we fail without force majeure. $4 million. Enough to force a land sale. Enough to make a water rights transfer look like rescue rather than theft. Grant leaned forward. That is why we need decisive management. If regulators, buyers, or employees receive conflicting instructions from you, we risk everything. You mean if I ask questions? I mean if you forget what you approved. He allowed the cruelty to remain visible this time. Then he tapped the signature line. We need this completed before the festival. Why then? The buyer's representative will attend. He wants to see stable leadership before countersigning. Stable leadership, operational continuity, medical evaluation, different phrases for the same removal. I let my shoulders sink. I'd like time to read it. Grant's tone softened. Of course. Claire can go through it with you. I can still read. I know he said it the way one praises a child for remembering her address. That evening, I sat on the back porch with a blanket across my knees. Claire brought tea and lowered herself into Daniel's old chair. After several minutes, she said, "The place Grant found is beautiful." I kept my eyes on the orchard. What place? A residential community near Bend. It isn't a nursing home. They have private cottages, gardens, art classes, medical staff if you need them. Bend was more than 3 hours away. You've selected where I'm going to live. No one selected anything. You just described my cottage. Claire's cup rattled against its saucer. It would only be after the festival, just for an evaluation period. Below us, the first lights came on inside the packing shed. Workers moved behind the windows, preparing fruit for a contract that could ruin them all. When were you planning to tell me? I asked. Claire looked down at her tea. Grant already paid the deposit. For 3 days, I behaved as though the deposit in Bend had settled everything. I did not argue with Claire. I did not ask Grant to cancel it. I did not remind Nolan that the house, the orchard, and the eastern well still legally belonged to me. Instead, I began giving things away. At breakfast, I handed Claire the ring of keys Daniel had carried for 30 years. The brass tags were worn smooth from his fingers. You should have these, I said. Claire stared at them in my palm. Mom, you don't have to do this yet. I would rather choose the moment than have everyone wait for me to fail. The sentence hurt her. I needed it to. Grant sat across the table, pretending to focus on his coffee. I watched the reflection of his face in the dark window behind Claire. He was listening to every word. I turned to Nolan. You should supervise the equipment inventory before winter. He frowned. I already do, then put it in writing. I don't want anyone questioning your authority after I leave. His expression softened for the first time in weeks. Grant finally looked up. This is a healthy step, Evelyn. I gave him a tired smile. You were right. I've made the transition harder than it needed to be. Claire's eyes filled. Please don't say it like that. How should I say it? Like you're going somewhere to rest. Not disappearing. I reached across the table and touched her wrist. I'm not disappearing, that was true. By noon, Grant's caution had begun to loosen. He invited me into the office to review what he called legacy materials, old deeds, historical photographs, orchard maps, and employee records that could be displayed at the festival. You know these better than anyone, he said. A week earlier, I had been considered too confused to enter the chemical building. Now he wanted my help because family history no longer threatened his plans. He gave me access to the conference room and left 3 file boxes on the table. Take your time, he said. No pressure. Then he walked out without locking the cabinet behind him. That was my apology's first reward. I spent the afternoon sorting photographs while listening to activity beyond the half-open door. Grant took 2 calls from the export buyer. Nolan discussed refrigeration capacity. Claire argued with a festival vendor about electrical access. No one lowered their voice when they passed me. I had become furniture. Near 3 o'clock, Grant returned carrying the temporary operating resolution. We should schedule a fully signing, he said. Nothing formal, perhaps dinner Sunday. I looked at the pages without reaching for them. I've been thinking. His shoulders tightened slightly. I let the silence work before continuing. If you're responsible for operations, your name should be on the export certifications. Grant blinked. The grower declaration has traditionally been signed by the owner. Then change the practice. That may not be necessary. I won't be here to inspect every lot. If I sign and something goes wrong, you'll have to defend decisions made under your authority, using my name. He studied me. I lowered my voice. That is not fair to you. Flattery works best when it resembles concern. Grant walked to the window. The buyer may prefer continuity. Then tell him continuity means the person making the decisions accepts responsibility for them. He turned back. You're comfortable with that? I'm relieved by it. He watched my face for weakness, deception, or perhaps the old defiance he had learned to expect. I gave him none. At last he nodded. I'll have counsel revise the documents. My hands remained folded in my lap. Inside, something cold and steady clicked into place. By Sunday dinner, I had perfected the performance. I apologized to Nolan for questioning his loyalty. I told Claire I was grateful she had found a place where I would not be alone. I thanked Grant for saving Mercer Ridge after Daniel's death. That final lie almost caught in my throat. Grant raised his wineglass to fresh beginnings. I lifted mine but did not drink. After dinner, he spread the operating documents across the dining table. He walked me through them slowly, pausing after each paragraph as though I might lose the thread. I asked simple questions. Where would I sign? When would the transfer begin? Would I still be allowed to visit the packing house? Claire cried again. Grant answered with kindness so polished it felt rehearsed. The transfer would become effective at the Harvest Heritage Festival immediately after the public announcement of my retirement. He said the timing would reassure employees, lenders, and the European buyer. I pretended to struggle with the signature line. Then I set down the pen. Could I review the orchard maps before I sign? I want to mark the commas block for Sophie. She always liked that part of the ridge. Grant smiled. Of course. He brought a thick portfolio from the office and placed it beside me. Most of the maps were familiar. Irrigation zones, frost fans, access roads, soil types, drainage grades. Then I saw a page printed on heavier paper. Grant was speaking to Claire near the kitchen. His back to me. I slid the page free. It was a subsurface hydrogeological survey. Colored layers showed basalt formations hundreds of feet beneath Mercer Ridge. A blue band ran below the eastern acreage, broader and deeper than the existing well. At the bottom, a boxed estimate listed potential extraction volume. More than 2 million gallons per day. My eyes moved to the economic assessment attached behind it. The projected value of long-term commercial water rights exceeded the appraised value of the orchard, the house, the packing facility, and every acre of fruit-bearing land combined. Grant had not discovered a struggling farm, he had discovered a reservoir. A handwritten note appeared in the margin beside the eastern blocks. Agricultural productivity decline supports conversion case. I read it twice. The damaged trees were not an unfortunate side effect. They were part of the argument. If the orchard failed, Grant could claim the land was no longer economically viable. He could push the family towards selling agricultural rights while preserving access to the water beneath them. I heard footsteps. I returned the survey to the portfolio and placed my hands on the table. Grant entered carrying the revised certification pages. "Everything all right?" he asked. I looked up with the expression of a woman who had understood nothing. I was trying to remember where Daniel planted the first camas trees. Grant relaxed. "North Ridge, of course," I said. "I keep forgetting." He laid the documents before me. At the top of the new grower declaration, one name had replaced mine. Grant Kessler, acting operating director. I smiled and reached for the pen, but in my mind, I was still staring at the handwritten sentence beside the aquifer map. Grant was not trying to inherit Mercer Ridge. He was trying to make the orchard die. I signed nothing that night. I let the pen hover above the grower declaration, then pressed my fingertips against my temple. "I'm tired," I said. "Could we finish this at the festival?" Grant concealed his disappointment well. Of course, he gathered the documents without urgency. In his mind, postponement no longer meant resistance. It meant decline. Claire helped me upstairs, one hand beneath my elbow. At my bedroom door, she kissed my cheek. "You're doing the right thing." I watched her walk back toward her husband. For the first time, I wondered whether she understood what the right thing would cost. I waited until the house was silent before removing my coded notebook from beneath a loose floorboard in the closet. Daniel had repaired that board twice, and never managed to stop it from creaking. Grant knew where I hid papers in desks and cars. He did not know the habits of the house. I recorded everything I remembered from the survey. The aquifer's estimated yield, the projected commercial value, the proposed conversion from agricultural use, and the handwritten sentence that changed the nature of the entire crime. Agricultural productivity decline supports conversion case. Grant needed the orchard to fail. The chemical entering the irrigation system was not simply a shortcut to improve fruit size or rescue a weak crop. Used in repeated concentrations, a synthetic growth regulator could damage fine roots, distort future budding, and create inconsistent yields across several seasons. The contamination might help the current fruit look marketable while quietly weakening the trees that produced it. A dying orchard would become evidence. Grant could point to shrinking yields, rising costs, and failed organic certification. He could tell the family that farming no longer made financial sense. Then, Cascade Renewable Holdings, or another company hidden behind it, could acquire access to the eastern acreage and sell the water beneath it. The pears were camouflage. The real harvest was underground. At dawn, I walked to Daniel's old study and opened the locked cabinet where we kept deeds, easements, and water rights agreements. Grant had searched for my investigation notes, but old legal files bored him. Men like Grant respected only documents they believed they could monetize. I found the original Eastern well permit beneath a bundle of frost insurance records. The water right was appurtenant to Mercer Ridge. It could not be separated from the land without state review and approval from the controlling ownership entity. That explained the guardianship strategy. Grant could not simply steal the well. He needed authority to speak for the owner. He needed me medically diminished, operationally removed, and publicly portrayed as incapable of understanding the transaction. I read the family company agreement again. Mercer Ridge Orchards was divided into voting interests. I held 40%, Claire and Nolan each held 25%. The remaining 10% belonged to a trust Daniel had established for Sophie. Any permanent transfer of water rights required 75% approval. Without my vote, Grant still needed Claire, Nolan, and access to Sophie's trust. Nolan might support a sale if he believed it would save the business. Claire had already signed documents she did not fully understand. Sophie's trust was controlled by Claire until she turned 18. Grant did not need to convince the family. He needed to control one woman, my daughter. At breakfast, Claire looked exhausted. A pale bruise colored the inside of her wrist. It was small enough to have come from a cabinet door or a tight bracelet. I would not turn one mark into a conclusion, but I noticed how quickly she pulled her sleeve down when she saw me looking. Grant entered behind her. "Big day," he said. "The buyer's legal team approved the revised certification." He kissed Claire's temple. She flinched barely. Then she smiled. I had spent weeks studying Grant's lies. I had not studied my daughter's fear. He poured coffee and turned to me. "I also spoke to the residential community in Bend. They can move your evaluation period forward if necessary." "How kind. They want the medical forms by Friday." Claire stirred sugar into a cup she did not drink from. "Friday seems fast," she said. Grant's voice remained light. "We discussed this, I know. I just thought after the festival, the cottage may not remain available." Claire's spoon stopped moving. He did not threaten her. He did not need to. The threat lived in the certainty of his tone. I looked down at my toast. "I don't want to cause trouble." Grant's attention returned to me. "You aren't." That was another lie. After breakfast, I asked Claire to help me choose clothes for Bend. She followed me upstairs, relieved to have a task that sounded harmless. I laid 2 sweaters on the bed. "Which one makes me look less institutional?" She gave a weak laugh. "Mom, I'm trying to cooperate." "I know." While she folded the blue sweater, I said, "Grant showed me the orchard maps." Her hands paused. "Which maps?" "The water survey." The sweater slipped from her fingers, only an inch. Then she caught it. "I don't know what you mean." I watched her face carefully. "The aquifer beneath the eastern block." She turned toward the dresser. "Grant handles those reports. Did you sign the Cascade Renewable Holdings documents?" Her back remained to me. "I sign a lot of things, that is not an answer." She opened a drawer and began rearranging scarves. "Grant said it was refinancing. What exactly did he tell you?" "That the water assessment could improve the farm's borrowing position." "Did he mention commercial extraction?" "No." The answer came quickly, too quickly. "Claire, look at me." She closed the drawer but did not turn. "Please don't start this again. I am not asking whether you trust him. I am asking what you signed." Her shoulders shook once. "I don't remember." "You remember." Grant's footsteps sounded in the hallway. Claire finally faced me. There was fear in her eyes, but not the fear of a daughter watching her mother lose her mind. It was the fear of someone who knew the walls had ears. She stepped close, pretending to adjust the collar of my blouse. Her lips barely moved. "Stop asking about Cascade." Then she raised her voice. "The blue sweater will be perfect." Grant appeared in the doorway. "Everything all right?" Claire smiled too brightly. "We're packing." He looked from her to me. I allowed my expression to drift. "Packing for what?" Grant relaxed almost instantly. "For Bend, Evelyn, of course." He left us alone again. Claire's eyes filled, but she blinked the tears away. I wanted to ask whether Grant had threatened her, whether the bruise came from him, whether she had signed because she was deceived, frightened, or already helping him. Instead, I touched her hand. She pulled away. Later that afternoon, I accessed the state corporate registry from the library computer in town. Cascade Renewable Holdings had filed 2 amendments during the previous year. The second listed an authorized digital signatory. I expected Grant's name, I expected Nolan's. The account belonged to Claire Kessler. And according to the filing history, my daughter had authorized the company to negotiate Mercer Ridge's water rights 8 months earlier. I printed the corporate filing at the public library and folded it into my purse. For the entire drive home, one question repeated in my mind. Had Claire been deceived, or had she chosen Grant over the rest of us? There was no safe way to ask her directly. If she was helping him, I would expose how much I knew. If she was afraid of him, confrontation might place her in greater danger. So I waited until the next morning and became helpless again. Claire found me at the kitchen table, with the Bend admission forms spread in front of me. I had left several sections blank and signed my name in the wrong place on one page. "I can't make sense of these," I said. She set down her purse. "You don't have to finish them today." Grant said Friday. Her mouth tightened. He says a lot of things are urgent. That was the first honest sentence she had spoken about her husband in weeks. I slid the forms toward her. Will you help me? Claire sat beside me. She read until she reached a paragraph authorizing the facility to communicate with a court-appointed guardian. She stopped. This shouldn't be here. What does it mean? It means they can release information to someone appointed to manage your affairs. Has anyone been appointed? No, the answer came too quickly. I touched the paper. Then why include it? Standard language, Grant's kind of explanation. I let my eyes drift toward the window. Perhaps I should sign whatever makes things easier. Claire turned sharply. Don't say that, why not? Because that's how this happened. The room went still. How what happened? She walked to the sink and stared into the empty basin. Grant told me the company needed a separate entity to negotiate refinancing. He said lenders would not touch the orchard while ownership and management were divided. Cascade Renewable Holdings. Her shoulders rose. Yes, you signed as its authorized representative. He said it was temporary. What else did you sign? I don't know. You do know, Claire. She spun around. No, I don't. That's the point. He brought papers home after Sophie went to bed. He put tabs on the signature lines and explained everything while answering calls. If I slowed down, he said I was proving why he had to handle the business. I said nothing. Claire wiped her face. The first documents were about the line of credit. Then there were water assessments and something involving Sophie's trust. Every time I questioned him, he reminded me the freeze nearly destroyed us. Did you know about commercial extraction? Not at first. At first? I saw an email 3 months ago. A bottling company wanted an option on the eastern acreage. Grant said it was only leverage for the bank, and you believed him. I needed to. I removed the filing from my purse and placed it on the table. Claire stared at her name. I never filed this. It was made through your account. I don't have an account. Grant created one in your name. Her face lost what little color remained. Why are you afraid of him? I asked. Her eyes moved to the bruise beneath her sleeve. He has never hit me. That was not my question. He records things, arguments, times I lose my temper, times Sophie refuses to go to school. He keeps copies of my therapy bills and prescriptions. For what? He says if I destroy the family, he'll prove I'm unstable. He threatened to take Sophie. Claire nodded. He said the orchard pays for our house, her school, everything. He said a judge would see him as the stable parent, and me as an emotional woman living off her mother. I took her hand. You signed because you were frightened. I signed because I was weak. No, you were isolated. Tears slid down her cheeks. Is there a difference when the damage is the same? A door closed in the mudroom. Claire pulled away. Nolan entered carrying a ledger. He looked at the papers. What's going on? Ben forms, Claire said. The lie came naturally to her too. Grant wants Mom's signature on the equipment transfer before lunch. I'm resting, I said. He looked at me for a long moment. There was guilt in his face. But guilt is not courage. After he left, Claire whispered, you can't trust him. Nolan? I don't know who he's protecting anymore. That afternoon, I called Anita Feldman from the laboratory landline. Anita had handled Daniel's estate and revised the Mercer Ridge Company agreement after his death. At 62, she had the calm manner of someone who had watched many families turn grief into litigation. I met her and Lena after dark in a private room near the river. Lena brought the pressure graph, I brought the shipping label, the corporate filing, Mateo's fitting, and my coded notes. Anita read everything twice. We have suspicion, she said. Not a case. What would make it a case? A valid analysis tied to a legally collected sample. Proof Grant controlled the system. Proof he made material representations to a buyer or lender. And evidence that the competency process is being used to seize assets. Lena tapped the graph. I can arrange lawful sampling under a regional groundwater survey, but it has to look routine. Grant will interfere, I said. Then interference becomes evidence, Anita replied. I told them about the export contract and my suggestion that Grant sign the certification himself. Anita smiled. Let him. She outlined the beginning of a plan. The operating transfer would not be blocked. It would be narrowed so the acting director personally certified crop inputs, water management, and regulatory compliance. Grant would believe he was receiving authority. In reality, he would be attaching his name to every contaminated crate. We still need Claire, Anita said. She's afraid. Fear does not make her useless, it makes timing important. My phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number contained a photograph of a court notice taped to my front door. Anita enlarged it. At the top were the words "Petition for Emergency Protective Guardianship." The hearing date was 10 days away. Grant was no longer waiting for me to sign myself out of Mercer Ridge. He was asking a judge to remove me. The guardianship petition changed our timetable. Until then, Grant needed my cooperation to make the transfer look peaceful. Now he was preparing to take my authority by court order. If the judge accepted Dr. Reese's evaluation and my family's testimony, Grant could control the orchard before the festival ever began. Anita studied the hearing notice. Emergency petitions move quickly, she said, especially when the family claims there is financial risk. What risk? She'll be accused of creating it, Lena said. Anita nodded. Grant will point to the export contract, the damaged crop, and Evelyn's objections. He'll say an impaired owner is threatening employees and lenders. I looked at the photograph of the notice taped to my door. Can we stop the hearing? We can oppose it, Anita said. But if we reveal everything now, Grant will destroy whatever evidence remains. The room fell quiet. That was the shape of our problem. Moving too slowly could cost me control of Mercer Ridge. Moving too quickly could erase the proof that Grant had poisoned it. Lena folded the pressure graph. I can begin the groundwater survey tomorrow. Will Grant know it came from me? No. The residential well below your eastern block showed unusual nighttime pressure changes. That gives the county an independent reason to test. What do you need from the orchard? Access to the lower well, the main irrigation junction, and 2 soil locations. I'll arrive with a technician, sealed containers, field blanks, and a body camera. Anita looked at me. You cannot touch the samples, I know. You cannot guide them toward a result. I know, and if Grant refuses access, do not argue. That will be difficult. It will also be useful. By 7 the next morning, a white county truck rolled through the south gate. I watched from the kitchen window, while Lena and a young technician stepped out wearing reflective vests. Each carried a locked sampling case. Grant crossed the yard before they reached the office. I could not hear the first exchange, but I saw his shoulders stiffen when Lena showed him the county authorization. He called Nolan, then he called someone else. 5 minutes later, Claire came into the kitchen. There are inspectors outside, I saw them. Did you call them? I buttered a piece of toast slowly. Why would I call water inspectors? She searched my face. I let my attention drift toward the stove clock. What day is it? Her suspicion dissolved into concern. Thursday, of course. That question tasted bitter, but it worked. Grant entered without knocking. The county is conducting a regional groundwater survey. That sounds sensible, I said. They want access to the eastern well. It is our well. His eyes narrowed slightly. You have no objection? Should I? No, he smiled. I only wanted to make sure this wouldn't upset you. By then, he had learned to use my supposed confusion as a shield. He believed anything dangerous would come from the woman I had been, not the woman I was pretending to become. Lena began at the residential well below our property. From there, she moved uphill to the creek intake, and finally to Mercer Ridge. Every sample was photographed before collection. The technician recorded the seal number, temperature, time, weather, and coordinates. A field blank remained sealed to detect contamination during transport. I watched from the porch and did nothing. That was harder than any test I had ever performed. At the main irrigation junction, Grant stood close enough to read every label. He asked whether the survey involved a complaint. Lena answered that the county did not disclose preliminary sources. When she requested access to the restricted storage room, his tone changed. That building contains proprietary inventory. It also connects to the eastern irrigation line. Who told you that? Lena glanced at the pipe entering the wall. The pipe told me. Grant refused access without a separate warrant. Lena did not challenge him. She documented the refusal on camera, sealed the exterior swab she had lawfully collected from the junction, and moved on. Interference had become part of the record. That afternoon, Mateo came to the house to replace what he loudly called a faulty pressure regulator. Grant had approved the repair because an export buyer's inspector was expected the following week. Mateo installed a new commercial gauge beside the lower pump. What Grant did not know was that the gauge contained an independent mechanical recorder authorized as part of the county survey. It did not transmit data or enter his network. It simply marked pressure changes on a sealed paper drum. If the hidden line activated after midnight, the orchard would write its own confession. Mateo finished near sunset. As he packed his tools, he whispered, "The recorder holds 7 days. That should be enough. If he finds it, he won't know what it is. He knows equipment, so do you." Mateo looked toward the office. "Mr. Kessler wrote my licensing recommendation, and you earned it. That may not matter if he withdraws it." I understood the fear beneath his words. Justice often asks ordinary people to risk the only future they can see. "I will not ask you to do more than you can live with," I said. He nodded, but neither of us believed the choice would remain that simple. After dinner, Sophie appeared in my bedroom carrying her camera and an external hard drive. She locked the door behind her. "Grandma, I think I filmed something." She connected the drive to my old laptop. The video was a time-lapse project she had recorded from the attic window over several weeks. She had been photographing stars above the eastern ridge, taking one frame every 30 seconds. At 1:56 in the morning, headlights appeared on the service road. A tanker truck entered through the restricted gate. At 2:01, the lights near the eastern pump came on. The truck remained for more than an hour. We watched 3 different nights. The same vehicle returned each time. Sophie enlarged one frame. A faded logo appeared on the tanker's door, Blue River Industrial Recovery. I searched the name through the state registry. The company had surrendered its waste handling license 11 months earlier. On paper, it no longer operated, yet its truck had been visiting our well after midnight. "Does Dad know you have this?" I asked. "No, he told me to erase anything filmed near the packing shed." "Where is the original memory card?" She removed it from the lining of her camera bag. I placed it in a clean envelope and wrote the date across the seal. The next morning, before Lena could retrieve the pressure recorder, Grant called the entire maintenance crew into the yard. He stood beside the eastern pump with a demolition contractor. "The old irrigation system comes out tomorrow," he announced. "Every pipe, valve, and control box." Then he looked directly at me. By sunrise, the hidden line and weeks of physical evidence would be gone. The demolition crew arrived before sunrise. 3 trucks rolled through the eastern gate, while fog still lay between the pair rows. Their headlights swept across the pump house, the restricted storage building, and the ground where Mateo had installed the county recorder less than 24 hours earlier. Grant had moved the schedule forward. I watched from my bedroom window as men unloaded saws, pipe cutters, and a compact excavator. Mateo stood near the lower junction with his tool case at his feet. Even from a distance, I could see the stiffness in his posture. He had expected Lena to retrieve the recorder at 7. The crew began at 6:15. I dressed quickly and walked down the hill with my cane, making sure my steps looked uncertain. Grant was speaking to the demolition supervisor beside the eastern pump. When he saw me, irritation crossed his face before concern replaced it. "You should be inside," he said. "I heard machinery. We're replacing the old irrigation line. Today?" We discussed it. Perhaps he had not. That uncertainty was the weapon he had trained everyone to use against me. Mateo glanced toward the brass housing that concealed the recorder. The demolition supervisor was already marking sections of pipe with orange paint. In less than 20 minutes, he would cut through the junction and expose everything. I needed a delay long enough for Lena to arrive with legal authority. "Which line are you removing?" I asked. Grant pointed toward the lower assembly. "All of it. That valve feeds the frost system." "No, it doesn't. It did when Daniel installed it." Nolan came around the pump house carrying rolled plans. "Mom, the frost main was rerouted years ago, was it?" He opened the plans and showed me a blue line running west. The drawing was accurate for the visible system. It did not show Mateo's hidden pipe or the altered connection beneath the concrete pad. I leaned closer, pretending to struggle with the symbols. "That cannot be right." Grant's patience thinned. "It is right. Then why is the bypass gate open?" Every man nearby looked toward the manifold. The bypass gate was not open, but Grant looked anyway. That was all I needed. I stepped past him. gripped the red wheel on the purge valve, and turned it hard. The valve released with a metallic groan. Water exploded from the relief outlet. A pressurized stream struck the gravel, spraying mud across the crew's boots. The pump motor shuddered, then let out a grinding whine. Gauges along the manifold jumped so violently that one needle snapped against its stop. The supervisor shouted for everyone to clear the pad. Grant lunged toward the control panel. "What did you do?" I stepped back, widening my eyes. "I thought it was the bypass. You opened the purge under full pressure. I told you the plan was wrong." Matteo ran to the main cutoff and killed the pump. The motor slowed, but a deep vibration continued beneath the concrete. He crouched beside the exposed line, listening. "We can't cut this," he said. Grant rounded on him. "Why not? Pressure hasn't bled off. The pump is off. There's still feed in the lower branch." Grant stared at the gauge. The hidden pipe was supplying residual pressure. Matteo had just told him without telling him. The supervisor shook his head. "We don't touch it until the system is isolated and certified." "My insurance won't cover a live line. How long?" Grant asked. "Could be an hour, could be a day." Grant turned toward me. There was no kindness left in his face. "You knew exactly which valve that was." I let my cane slip from my hand. It struck the gravel and rolled beneath the manifold. "I made a mistake." "You don't make mistakes around irrigation systems." "Nolan says I do." Silence followed. Nolan looked down. Grant studied me with a new intensity, as though the blurred outline he had assigned to me was coming back into focus. Then the county truck appeared at the top of the road. Lena arrived at 7 exactly. She stepped out wearing her reflective vest and raised one eyebrow at the flooded work area. "We're scheduled to retrieve monitoring equipment," she said. Grant blocked her path. "This site is closed for emergency repairs." Lena lifted a sealed county authorization. "Then the timing is excellent. Emergency conditions must be documented before alteration." The demolition supervisor wanted no part of a dispute with the county. He ordered his crew to stand down. Lena photographed the manifold, the pressure readings, the blue residue washed across the gravel, and the location of the hidden branch. Her technician removed the recorder under continuous video. The paper drum showed 6 nighttime pressure spikes. Grant watched every movement. He did not interfere again. That frightened me more than shouting would have. By 10, the county truck had left with sealed samples and the original pressure chart. The demolition crew departed without cutting a single pipe. I had won the morning, but Grant now knew the helpless old woman was not as helpless as she appeared. At lunch, he said nothing about the valve. He ate quietly while Claire spoke about festival seating and Nolan reviewed refrigeration schedules. I allowed my spoon to tremble. Grant never looked away from my hands. That afternoon, I returned to my bedroom and found the closet door open. The loose floorboard had been lifted. My coded notebook was gone. I checked beneath the bed, inside the dresser, and behind Daniel's old coat. Nothing. The notebook did not contain plain accusations. Most pages looked like soil formulas and weather observations. But one entry used Lena's initials openly because I had written it in haste. Beside her name was the scheduled time for the official sampling retrieval. 7 o'clock that morning. Grant had not guessed that I was investigating him. He had read it before the county truck arrived, and he had moved the demolition crew to 6:15 because my own notebook told him exactly how much time he had. Grant did not mention the missing notebook. That was how I knew he had taken it. At breakfast, he buttered toast for Claire, asked Nolan about refrigeration capacity, and discussed the festival as though the previous morning had been nothing more than a maintenance delay. Then he placed a revised schedule beside my plate. "The buyer's representative has changed his travel plans," he said. "We're moving the leadership announcement and contract signing to Saturday." I looked at the date. Saturday was 3 days away. The festival begins Tuesday. The public festival does. The private harvest reception will be Saturday evening. We never had a private reception. We do now. Claire looked up from her coffee. "You said next week." Grant did not turn toward her. "The buyer cannot stay." Nolan scanned the schedule. "Can we have the first export lot packed by then? If everyone stops creating delays." His eyes settled on me. The message was clear. He knew I had been working with Lena. He knew the county had collected the pressure chart. And whatever he intended to do, He now planned to complete it before those results returned. I folded the schedule. Saturday sounds lovely. Grant watched me for a moment, searching for resistance. I gave him none. An hour later, Anita called the laboratory landline. Lena has been removed from the survey. I gripped the receiver. Removed by whom? Her division director, Cascade's attorney, filed a formal complaint, alleging she has a personal conflict with you. Our dispute was 12 years ago. They included minutes from the irrigation hearings. They're claiming she is using county resources to retaliate against Mercer Ridge. What happens to the samples? They remain sealed, but analysis has been suspended pending internal review. How long? Longer than 3 days. Grant had not merely moved his deadline, he had cut the road behind us. Can another official take over? Eventually, but the laboratory will not release findings until the complaint is resolved. I looked through the laboratory window toward the eastern slope. Workers were already removing hoses and clearing access for the demolition crew's return. What about the exterior swab and pressure recorder? Useful, but not enough by Saturday. Then we stopped the signing. Anita was silent. If we seek an injunction now, she said, we expose Claire, Mateo, the video, and the alteration to the operating agreement. Grant will know the entire case. He already knows enough. He knows you suspect him. He does not know where the final trap is. We don't have a final trap, then build one from what he cannot destroy. After the call, I found Mateo in the equipment shed. He was removing his name from the weekend maintenance board. You're not working Saturday? I asked. He kept his back to me. I'm leaving Mercer Ridge when? Today. He placed 2 wrenches into his case. Grant spoke to the licensing board. He said I installed unauthorized monitoring equipment and caused the pressure failure. The county authorized that recorder. He said, I concealed it from management. You did not cause the failure. That won't matter if he files a safety complaint. I stepped closer. Mateo, the pressure chart may prove someone was using the hidden line. And if it doesn't? His voice cracked. I have a wife. My father is on my insurance. I've spent 8 years qualifying for that license. I know no. Ma'am, you know the orchard. You don't know what happens to people like me when someone with money says we're dishonest. The truth of that silenced me. I had been prepared to risk my land, my reputation, even my relationship with my children. I had not fully considered what I was asking others to risk. I will not stop you, I said. He closed the case. At the doorway, he paused. The hidden line has a manual shutoff under the restricted storage floor. If he drains it before inspectors return, the pipe may test clean. Can you show me where? Mateo shook his head. I've already done too much. Then he left. By afternoon, our plan had lost its scientist, its witness, and 3 days. I went to the packing house and watched workers sort the first export lot. Pairs moved beneath white inspection lights, rolling in neat green lines toward labeled cartons. Grant could remove a pipe. He could delay water analysis. He could discredit me and frighten Mateo. But he could not erase what the trees had already absorbed. Fruit was biological memory. If the eastern blocks had received the chemical for weeks, residues might remain in the peel and flesh. The export buyer would require pre-shipment testing. Grant had probably controlled the samples used for those certificates. He expected us to prove where the contamination came from. We did not need to, not yet. We only needed to prove that the lot he personally certified was not organic. If Grant signed responsibility for the crop before an independent test, he would have to explain why forbidden residue existed in fruit he claimed to have supervised. I called Anita again. Forget the water for Saturday. What are you thinking? Can the buyer require an on-site verification test before accepting the lot? Yes, if the contract allows it. Make sure it does. The contract is Grant's. The operating resolution is ours. Silence. Then Anita understood. We would not catch him pumping chemicals into the soil. We would let him claim the harvest as his own. That evening, I went looking for Sophie. Her bedroom was empty. Her camera bag was gone, but her coat and wallet remained. I called her phone. It rang upstairs. I found it beneath her pillow. On the screen was an unsent message addressed to me. Dad found my videos. He says I ruined everything. I'm going somewhere. He can't delete them. I ran downstairs and demanded to know where she was. Claire stared at me in confusion. Grant stood near the fireplace, holding Sophie's external hard drive in one hand. Its plastic casing had been smashed open. "She's being dramatic," he said, like her grandmother. Outside, darkness had settled over the orchard. Sophie was 16, frightened, and alone somewhere beyond the lights of Mercer Ridge. And the original memory card containing our strongest evidence was with her. Claire called the sheriff. Grant told her not to. "She's 16, he said. "She wants attention. Sending deputies across the orchard will only reward her." Claire snatched her phone away from him. "Our daughter is missing. She is not missing. She is hiding." I stood between them, staring at the shattered hard drive in Grant's hand. "Where did you find that?" "In her room. You searched her room?" "I'm her father. You destroyed her property." I stopped her from distributing private business footage. Claire pressed the phone to her ear and walked toward the kitchen, giving the dispatcher our address. Grant looked at me. "You filled her head with this." "No," I said. "You frightened her." His mouth tightened. Before he could answer, headlights swept across the front windows. A pickup truck stopped beside the porch. Mateo climbed out first. Sophie emerged from the passenger side with her camera bag clutched against her chest. Claire ran outside barefoot. She wrapped Sophie in both arms, crying and scolding her at the same time. Sophie held herself stiff for several seconds before collapsing against her mother. Grant remained in the doorway. His face showed relief for exactly one breath. Then he saw Mateo. "What is she doing with you?" "She came to my house," Mateo said. "My wife called me because Sophie was scared to go home." "You had no right to keep my daughter." "I told her to call her mother." "You should have brought her back immediately." Sophie lifted her head. "I didn't want to come back while you were here." The words struck Grant harder than any accusation I had made. He stepped onto the porch. "What did you tell her?" he demanded of Mateo. "Nothing." Grant pointed toward the driveway. "You're trespassing." "Leave." Mateo did not move. "I'm returning an employee's family member to her home." "You are no longer an employee. Then you can mail my final check." Grant's hand curled at his side. For a moment I thought he might strike him. Claire must have thought so too, because she moved Sophie behind her. Mateo looked at me. "The card is safe." Grant's eyes shifted between us. "What card?" I let my face remain blank. Sophie answered before I could stop her. "The one you couldn't destroy." She unzipped the inner lining of her camera bag and removed the original memory card. Grant lunged forward. Claire stepped between them. "Do not touch her." The porch fell silent. It was the first direct order I had heard my daughter give her husband in months. Grant stopped, then he smiled. It was not kindness, it was recovery. He lifted both hands. "Everyone is exhausted. We have the most important event in this orchard's history tomorrow. We are not going to destroy our family over a teenager's misunderstanding." Sophie placed the memory card in my palm. "No," she said. "We're going to stop pretending it's a misunderstanding." I sealed the card with Anita before midnight. By Saturday afternoon, Mercer Ridge no longer looked like a poisoned orchard. It looked like a postcard. White tents lined the hill above the packing house. Strings of lights hung between cedar posts. Tables were covered in linen the color of ripe pears. Local officials, lenders, growers, and employees arrived in polished shoes that sank into the damp ground. A Dutch flag stood beside the American flag near the stage for the benefit of the export buyer's representative. Grant had invited nearly everyone whose opinion could protect him. That made the reception perfect for us. I dressed in a gray skirt, a cream blouse, and the blue sweater Claire had selected for Bend. I carried Daniel's old cane, though I did not need it on level ground. When I entered the packing house, conversation softened. People had already heard some version of my decline. Several longtime employees hugged me too carefully. A banker spoke loudly and slowly, asking whether I was enjoying retirement. One woman took my elbow without permission while guiding me toward my chair. I accepted every humiliation. A trap works only when the bait appears harmless. At the front of the room, a display screen showed photographs of Mercer Ridge through the decades. Daniel beside the first tractor, Nolan and Claire as children on wooden picking ladders. Grant had placed himself in the final images, shaking hands with buyers, inspecting fruit, standing beneath the new company slogan. He had edited our history before acquiring our future. Anita sat near the buyer's legal advisor. Lena was absent, officially removed from the investigation. Mateo stood outside the main doors, no longer wearing a Mercer Ridge badge. Sophie moved among the guests with her camera. Claire stayed close to her. Nolan found me before the speeches began. He wore Daniel's brown harvest jacket. "You look nice," he said. "So do you." He glanced toward Grant. "The contract keeps everyone working. I know, we can fix the other problems after harvest." "What other problems?" His eyes dropped. "The water, the paperwork, whatever Grant has been hiding. You know he has been hiding something. I know he cuts corners. He poisoned the Eastern Bloc." Nolan's jaw tightened. "You don't know that. You repaired the pumps. I repaired what he told me to repair. That is not the same as innocence." He stepped closer. "If this contract collapses, 40 families lose winter income. And if contaminated fruit crosses an international border, we deal with it, after whose child eats it." His face hardened. "You always do this. You turn every choice into a test no one can pass." "No, Nolan, Grant did that. He made you choose between the truth and the payroll, knowing you would call fear responsibility." He looked as though I had slapped him. Then he walked toward the stage and took his place beside Grant. My son had chosen his side. At 7, the lights dimmed. Grant stepped behind the podium while applause filled the packing house. He thanked the workers, praised Claire's tourism program, and described Mercer Ridge as a family enterprise ready to enter a global future. Then he turned toward me. "For every successful family business, there comes a moment when one generation must trust the next." A spotlight found my chair. Grant extended his hand. I rose slowly, leaning on the cane, and walked to the stage. He kissed my cheek for the cameras. "Evelyn has decided to retire from active leadership," he announced. "This was not easy for her, but it was necessary for her health and for the stability of Mercer Ridge." Applause moved uncertainly through the room. Anita placed the operating documents on the signing table. Grant looked radiant. I looked frail. Everything was ready. Then he raised one finger. "Before we formalize the transition, I know some of you may wonder whether Evelyn fully understands this decision." A side door opened. Dr. Calvin Reese entered, carrying a leather folder. Grant welcomed him onto the stage and turned toward the crowd. "To protect Evelyn's dignity and remove any doubt, Dr. Reese has agreed to explain why she can no longer manage her own affairs." Dr. Calvin Reese walked onto the stage, as though he were entering a lecture hall. He wore a dark suit and carried the same leather folder I had seen in his Portland office. Grant shook his hand warmly, then stepped aside to give him the microphone. The crowd quieted. Reese opened the folder. "I cannot discuss private medical details," he began. "But Mrs. Mercer has authorized me to confirm that she is experiencing symptoms requiring reduced stress and supervision in complex decision-making." I had authorized no such statement. He avoided words like dementia or incapacity. A careful doctor knows how much damage can be done through implication. Grant placed one hand lightly against my back. "This is difficult for all of us," he told the audience. I looked toward Claire. She stood beside Sophie near the first row, her face rigid. Nolan remained on stage, staring at the floor. Anita rose from her seat. "Dr. Reese," she said, "did Mrs. Mercer sign a medical release permitting you to speak here tonight?" The room shifted. Reese looked toward Grant. Grant answered for him. "The family arranged appropriate consent. That was not my question." Anita walked toward the stage with the buyer's legal advisor beside her. Reese closed the folder. I was assured the necessary documentation had been completed. "By whom?" Grant stepped toward the microphone. "This is a family celebration, not a deposition." I touched his sleeve. "It's all right." He looked at me, surprised. I let my voice shake. "I don't want an argument. I want everyone to know I'm making this choice freely." The words soothed him. They also gave Anita the signal to stop pressing. Grant returned to the signing table. The first document was the temporary operating resolution. It named him acting operating director and granted authority over production, contracts, personnel, water management, and regulatory communication. Anita had revised it exactly as planned. The authority came with duties. Grant did not read those closely. He had already reviewed an earlier version and assumed the new pages differed only in formatting. That is the danger of arrogance. It makes repetition feel like verification. He handed me the pen. I signed the limited retirement acknowledgement on the first page. A camera flashed. The applause was gentle and uncomfortable. Grant signed beneath me. Then Anita placed the operating acceptance in front of him. This confirms the effective period of your management, she said. Grant scanned the signature page. The effective date is July 1st. You represented to the buyer, the bank, and Dr. Reese that you assumed primary operational control on that date, Anita said. We preserved your own timeline. He hesitated, only briefly. Changing the date would have weakened the case he had built for removing me. To claim I was incapable, he needed everyone to believe he had already been protecting the orchard for months. He signed. The second document covered the export contract, 180 truckloads of Anjou pears. Certified organic, fully traceable, produced without prohibited growth regulators. Grant signed as operating director. The third document certified crop inputs. He signed. The fourth certified water system oversight. He signed again. The fifth contained a personal representation that all information submitted to the buyer was complete and accurate to the best of his direct knowledge. This time, the buyer's representative stepped forward. He was a silver-haired man named Hendrik Voss. Until that evening, Grant believed Hendrik was simply an executive from a European hospitality distributor. He was also a former food safety auditor. Mr. Kessler, Hendrik said, this statement confirms that you personally supervised compliance during the current growing season. Grant glanced at Nolan. Nolan said nothing. Yes, Grant replied, not merely after tonight. No, since July, and you accept responsibility for the accuracy of the pre-shipment certifications. Grant smiled for the room. Absolutely. He signed his name with a flourish. Anita closed the folder. The trap had its first lock. Grant lifted the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, Mercer Ridge has officially entered a new era. At that moment, white headlights swept across the high windows of the packing house. A vehicle stopped outside, then another. The wide loading doors began to rise with a mechanical rattle. Grant turned. A white mobile laboratory truck rolled into the loading bay, followed by 2 state agriculture vehicles and a county environmental enforcement van. The room filled with whispers. 3 inspectors entered wearing identification badges and protective jackets. Behind them came Lena. Grant's face tightened. You were removed from this investigation. I was removed from the county groundwater survey, she said. I was not removed from a state agricultural inspection requested by the buyer. Hendrik lifted a copy of the signed contract. On-site verification is a condition of acceptance. Grant looked toward Anita. She said nothing. The lead inspector approached the stage. Mr. Kessler, we are placing the designated export lot under temporary hold pending residue analysis. You cannot interrupt contracted operations without cause. We have cause. From whom? From the buyer. Documented pressure anomalies, exterior residue collected under county authority, and a whistleblower report concerning unregistered nighttime deliveries. Grant's eyes moved through the crowd. He was looking for Matteo. Matteo stood in the open doorway. He had returned. Workers gathered along the sorting line as inspectors sealed the first pallets. Fruit was selected from cartons marked with Eastern Bloc lot codes. Each pear was photographed, numbered, and placed inside a sterile bag. Grant stepped off the stage. This is harassment. Those pears were already tested. The inspector faced him. By a laboratory selected through your office, a certified laboratory, whose submission form identified Evelyn Mercer as the responsible operator. Grant pointed at me. There, you see? She was in charge. Anita opened the signed operating acceptance. No, she said, Mr. Kessler has just certified before witnesses that he exercised direct operational control beginning July 1st. The color shifted in his face. Nolan moved backward from the table. The mobile laboratory required less than 30 minutes for a preliminary screen. Those 30 minutes felt longer than any season of my life. No one left. Grant made calls. None of them changed the sealed doors or the inspectors stationed beside the pallets. Finally, the laboratory technician entered carrying a printed report. She gave it to the lead inspector. He read the page, then looked at Grant. The export lot has tested positive for a prohibited synthetic growth regulator. A sound moved through the room. Not a gasp, but the low collective murmur of people realizing their jobs, reputations, and trust had just been placed inside a criminal investigation. Grant recovered quickly. This proves nothing about me. Contamination could have occurred months ago under Evelyn's management. Anita walked onto the stage and placed the final signed page beneath the document camera. Grant's own name appeared above the date, July 1st. Then she displayed an earlier bank declaration and the guardianship petition. Both contained the same claim. Grant had assumed complete control of crop inputs, water systems, and regulatory compliance 3 months earlier. You cannot have it both ways, Anita said. You cannot claim months of authority to remove Evelyn, then deny those same months when the poisoned fruit is opened. Grant stared at his signatures. For the first time that evening, he understood that every document he had used to bury me now formed a wall around him. Then the lead inspector received a message through his earpiece. He turned toward the loading doors. We have located the restricted storage room. Grant's head snapped up, and the officers have found a manual valve beneath the floor. The officers found the valve beneath a removable steel plate in the restricted storage room. A state investigator carried photographs into the packing house while another team secured the building. The images appeared on the document screen one by one. A black transfer hose descended through the concrete floor. Beneath it, a manual valve connected the chemical storage tanks to the hidden irrigation line Mateo had warned me about. The final photograph showed blue-gray residue packed around the coupling. Grant stared at the screen. That system was here before I took control. Mateo stepped through the loading doors. No, it wasn't. Every face in the room turned toward him. He no longer looked frightened. He looked tired. I installed part of it 8 weeks ago, he said. Mr. Kessler told me it was a fertilizer injection bypass. Grant pointed at him. You are a disgruntled former employee facing a safety complaint. Mateo's voice shook, but he continued, You ordered me to route it beneath the old slab so Mrs. Mercer wouldn't see a new line on the irrigation plans. That is a lie. I still have the original work message. He handed his phone to the investigator. Grant's expression changed. He had expected Mateo's fear to protect him forever. Lena entered with a second report. The county laboratory's internal review has been lifted, she announced. Grant turned on her. You were suspended. The complaint concerned my personal involvement. Another hydrologist reviewed the sealed samples and chain of custody records. She placed the findings beneath the camera. The same prohibited growth regulator had been detected in the eastern well junction, in the soil near row 17, and in the residential well below Mercer Ridge. A woman near the back of the room covered her mouth. Her family lived downhill from us, Lena continued. The concentration decreases with distance from the orchard. The pressure records and groundwater pattern identify Mercer Ridge as the likely source. The room erupted. Employees demanded to know whether their drinking water was safe. Neighboring growers shouted about contaminated wells. The buyer's representatives moved away from Grant as if dishonesty were contagious. Grant reached for the microphone. These tests are preliminary. Any contamination could have resulted from an equipment error. Nolan stepped onto the stage. For a moment, I believed he intended to defend Grant again. My son looked at the employees he had worked beside for most of his life. Then he looked at me. I changed the pump logs. The noise stopped. Grant moved toward him. Nolan, don't. Nolan's face twisted. You said the nighttime cycles were emergency root treatments. They were. You said the product was approved for conventional use and would be flushed before certification testing. Grant lowered his voice. Think about what you're doing. I have been thinking about it for 3 months. Nolan's hands trembled. He admitted that Grant had ordered him to alter operating times, remove maintenance entries, and mark several chemical deliveries as cleaning supplies. He said he knew the product was not approved for organic fruit. But I did not know it was entering the well, he said. I thought we were treating damaged trees to save the export crop. You knew enough, I told him. He looked at me, and the grief in his face belonged to the boy he had once been. Yes, he said. I knew enough to ask. I chose not to. Grant grabbed his arm. If you say another word, you destroy this orchard. Nolan pulled free. No, you taught us to confuse the orchard with you. He handed his phone to the investigators. The messages were still there. Instructions to run the eastern pump after midnight. Orders to change timestamps. A photograph of the hidden valve. A warning from Grant that if anyone questioned the records, Nolan should blame my cognitive episodes. My son had not planned the scheme. He had helped build its walls. Claire walked toward the stage with Sophie beside her. Grant's voice sharpened. Take Sophie outside. No, Claire said. He stared at her. It was the same look he had used at our breakfast table, in hospital corridors, and behind closed doors a silent command disguised as expectation. This time she did not obey. She handed Anita a folder. These are the documents Grant made me sign. Grant lunged toward her, but two enforcement officers stepped between them. Claire explained the late-night signature sessions, the threats about custody, the recordings he kept of her arguments and therapy appointments, the online account he had created in her name to authorize Cascade Renewable Holdings. I never agreed to sell the water rights, she said. He told me the company existed to refinance the farm. Grant laughed bitterly. You signed every page, because you told me you would take my daughter if I refused. You are unstable. Claire flinched, then Sophie reached for her hand. My mother is telling the truth. Sophie's time-lapse footage appeared on the screen. The original metadata showed the tanker entering Mercer Ridge on 6 separate nights. Each visit matched the pressure spikes and Nolan's altered pump records. Grant's charm was gone now. He paced beneath the screen, calling everyone liars, fools, and thieves. He accused Mateo of sabotage, Nolan of incompetence, Claire of mental illness, and me of manipulating the entire family. Dr. Reese began moving toward a side exit. Anita noticed. Doctor, please remain available. Reese stopped. A financial investigator approached him, carrying a bank summary. Cascade Renewable Holdings had transferred $45,000 to a medical consulting company, registered to Calvin Reese. The payments began 2 weeks before my first appointment. The final payment carried the notation, Capacity Review, Mercer Matter. Reese looked at Grant. Grant did not look back. That was when the doctor understood he had never been a partner. He had been another disposable instrument. I never diagnosed dementia, Reese said quickly. Mr. Kessler requested language supporting temporary supervision. Grant shouted that he was lying. Reese continued. He provided the family incidents. He selected the answers he wanted emphasized. He asked whether an emergency guardianship could be supported before the harvest reception. An investigator escorted Reese away from the stage. Grant stood alone beneath photographs, laboratory findings, contracts, messages, and signatures that all carried his design. Then he remembered the water transfer. I saw it happen in his eyes. If he could complete the sale before the state froze the company, he might still move the most valuable asset beyond our reach. He pulled out his phone and opened a banking application. Anita nodded to me. The revised company resolution had become effective the moment Grant signed it. It gave him operational responsibility, but permanently removed any acting director's authority to sell land or water rights without unanimous owner approval. Grant entered his security code. His thumb struck the transfer button. For 1 second, the screen showed a spinning circle. Then a red message appeared. Transfer reject. Ownership authority revoked. Grant read it twice. When he raised his head, there was nothing left in his face but panic. Grant stared at the rejected transfer notice as if the phone had betrayed him. Then he threw it. The device struck the edge of the signing table and shattered across the concrete floor. Several guests stepped back. Sophie raised her camera, but Claire lowered it gently. No more, she whispered. You don't need to record everything. Grant turned toward me. You did this. His voice no longer carried charm or authority. It was the raw voice of a man discovering that the people he controlled had become witnesses. You signed it, I said. You rewrote the resolution. My attorney clarified the limits of temporary operational authority. You trapped me. No, I gave you exactly what you demanded. Control of the harvest, responsibility for the crop. Your name on every decision. He took 1 step toward me. 2 state officers moved between us. The lead investigator informed Grant that he was being detained pending investigation into commercial fraud, falsification of agricultural certifications, environmental violations, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to obtain control of protected property through fraudulent guardianship proceedings. Grant laughed. It was a desperate, disbelieving sound. You cannot arrest someone over pears. Lena stood several feet away, holding the groundwater report. This is not about pears. Outside, additional vehicles arrived. State environmental officers sealed the eastern well and restricted storage building. Agriculture inspectors placed red hold notices on every export pallet. The county health department began contacting families whose wells lay downhill from Mercer Ridge. The festival guests had stopped being an audience. They were casualties calculating their losses. The Dutch buyer suspended the contract before leaving the building. Our organic certifier placed Mercer Ridge under emergency review. The bank representative informed Anita that the operating line would be frozen until the extent of liability became clear. 40 families who had applauded Grant less than an hour earlier now stood beside a packing line that might not reopen. Justice did not arrive cleanly. It arrived carrying invoices. Grant was escorted through the loading doors in handcuffs. He twisted toward Claire as the officers took him away. "You think they'll let you keep Sophie after this?" Claire went pale. Then Sophie stepped beside her. "I'm not going anywhere with you." Grant's face changed when he heard his daughter say it. For the first time, the loss seemed to reach him. Not the orchard, not the water rights, not the contracts. Her. He tried to speak, but an officer pushed him into the waiting vehicle. Dr. Reese left in a separate car. He had not yet been arrested, but his records, accounts, and communications were seized. Within days, the state medical board suspended his license, while prosecutors investigated the payments from Cascade Renewable Holdings. Mateo gave his statement until nearly midnight. Nolan gave his until dawn. I remained in the packing house with Anita while inspectors cataloged documents. Workers drifted home in silence, uncertain whether they still had jobs. Claire sat with Sophie in Daniel's old office. Neither of them wanted to return to the house Grant had controlled. At 4 a.m, Lena found me beside the sealed export pallets. "The preliminary residential tests show concentrations below acute toxicity," she said. "But repeated exposure is still a concern. The county will provide bottled water and medical guidance." "How far has it spread?" "We don't know yet." I looked toward the eastern windows and the orchard. Lena hesitated. That hesitation told me more than the answer. The final results arrived 11 days later. The contamination had entered the shallow fractured basalt beneath the eastern block and migrated toward 3 residential wells. Emergency filtration prevented a broader public health crisis, but the cleanup would take years. The eastern Anjou rows were lost, so were part of the camas trees Daniel had planted during our first profitable season. State officials ordered the removal of contaminated soil near the injection line. More than 20 acres had to be excavated. Every tree in that zone was cut down, chipped, and treated as controlled agricultural waste. I watched the first excavator enter row 17. The operator lowered the blade into ground Daniel and I had worked with our own hands. Roots rose from the soil in tangled masses, pale and exposed beneath the autumn sun. A mature orchard does not fall like a forest. It comes apart one deliberate tree at a time. Each trunk cracked before it dropped. The sound traveled across the slope and struck the house. Claire could not watch. Sophie did. She filmed from a distance, not for evidence this time, but because she said someone should remember what dishonesty cost. The criminal case expanded quickly. Investigators found that Blue River Industrial Recovery had been paying Grant to dispose of chemical waste illegally. He diluted part of that waste through our irrigation system while using selected compounds to manipulate the crop. At the same time, he negotiated a private option with a bottling consortium seeking access to the deep aquifer. He intended to let Mercer Ridge's agricultural value collapse, force a sale under financial pressure, and collect fees through Cascade Renewable Holdings. The guardianship petition was dismissed. Dr. Reese surrendered his license and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. Grant's accounts were frozen. The house he shared with Claire had been pledged as collateral without her informed consent. Vehicles, investment accounts, and business interests were seized. The man who had presented himself as the only person capable of saving Mercer Ridge had quietly mortgaged nearly everything connected to it. Nolan was not arrested that first week. His cooperation mattered. So did the fact that he had not known about the waste disposal arrangement or the water sale. But altered records were still altered records. Prosecutors charged him with falsifying operational logs and obstructing regulatory reporting. Anita negotiated his release while the case proceeded, but he was removed from all management authority. Some employees wanted him gone permanently. Others remembered the years he had repaired equipment in snow and worked overnight during harvest. Truth rarely divides people neatly. By December, Mercer Ridge's organic certification was suspended. The export contract was dead. We sold equipment and 2 non-contiguous parcels to fund cleanup, legal costs, and temporary wages. I preserved the core acreage, the house, and the deep water rights. But saving something is not the same as keeping it whole. One evening, I found Nolan standing at the edge of the cleared eastern block. Mud covered his boots. Beyond him, the land looked raw and empty where thousands of trees had once stood. I helped them remove the last irrigation line, he said. I nodded. He kept his eyes on the ground. Grant told me one bad season would finish us. He said you would rather let the orchard die than admit your methods were outdated. And you believed him. I wanted to. The honesty hurt more than an excuse would have. Nolan turned toward me. I spent my whole life thinking you and Dad loved this land more than me. Then Grant gave me a chance to prove I could save it. You did not save it, I know. His face folded with grief. Will you ever forgive me? Wind moved across the empty rows, carrying the smell of torn roots and wet soil. I opened my mouth. No answer came. 14 months after the eastern block was cleared, I stood beside Sophie beneath a cold March sky and watched her lower the first young pear tree into clean soil. The sapling was barely taller than she was. Its roots fit inside 2 open hands behind us. Mercer Ridge no longer looked like the orchard Daniel and I had built. The old packing house carried a different sign. Several fields had been sold. The eastern slope remained divided by monitoring wells, filtration equipment, and white posts marking the boundary of the restored soil. But the ground beneath our boots had passed its final test. Clean enough to plant, not restored, not forgiven, ready. There is a difference. Grant accepted a plea agreement 9 months after the harvest reception. The charges included commercial fraud, conspiracies, falsification of organic certifications, illegal disposal of industrial waste, environmental crimes, and attempting to obtain protected property through fraudulent guardianship proceedings. The judge sentenced him to 22 years in state and federal custody, with restitution orders that would follow him long after his prison term ended. At sentencing, he spoke for nearly 40 minutes. He blamed the waste company. He blamed the export market. He blamed regulators, climate pressure, family dysfunction, and what he called my refusal to modernize. He never blamed himself. Claire sat between Sophie and me while he spoke. She did not cry. She had spent too many years responding to his voice. Silence was the first thing she took back from him. When the judge asked whether she wished to make a statement, Claire stood. My husband did not begin by poisoning the land, she said. He began by teaching us to distrust our own memories. Then she sat down. That was all. Dr. Reese surrendered his medical license permanently. His cooperation helped prosecutors prove Grant had designed the guardianship case before my evaluation ever took place. Reese avoided prison, but the court ordered probation, restitution, and a public disciplinary record that would follow his name longer than any sentence he feared. Blue River Industrial Recovery's owners were prosecuted separately. Their insurers paid part of the groundwater cleanup, though legal payments never move as quickly as contamination does. The families below Mercer Ridge used filtration systems for most of the year. Their wells eventually tested clean, but I knew clean laboratory results could not immediately restore trust. For months, I attended community meetings where neighbors looked at me and saw the land the pollution came from. I did not remind them that Grant had deceived me. My name remained on the orchard. Responsibility has deeper roots than intent. Claire divorced Grant before the criminal case ended. She and Sophie moved into the farmhouse with me for a while, but Claire eventually rented a small place in town. She needed a home that had never contained her husband's footsteps. She now manages the tasting room and education program at Mercer Ridge. She speaks to agricultural groups about coercive control and financial abuse, though she still trembles before every presentation. Courage is not the absence of trembling. It is refusing to let the trembling decide. Sophie turned 17 that winter. Her documentary, Water Remembers, won a statewide student film competition. She included the nighttime tanker footage, the dead trees, the cleanup crews, and interviews with families living downstream. She also included a scene of Nolan washing mud from his hands beside the rebuilt irrigation line. I had asked her to remove it. She refused. People need to see that someone can cause harm without being the mastermind, she told me. She was right. Nolan pleaded guilty to falsifying operational records and obstructing regulatory reporting. Because he cooperated early, testified against Grant, and had not profited from the scheme, he avoided prison. He received probation, community service, and a prohibition against holding financial or regulatory authority at Mercer Ridge. The legal punishment was smaller than the one he gave himself. He spent the year working under the restoration contractor, removing damaged soil, installing monitoring equipment, and rebuilding the same irrigation system he had helped conceal. He did not ask me about forgiveness again. He showed up. Sometimes that is the first honest apology a person can make. On the morning we began replanting, Nolan arrived before sunrise. He unloaded stakes and protective sleeves from a flatbed truck, then stopped several yards away from me. "This row needs to shift north," he said. "The drainage is better there." I examined the slope. He was right. "Mark it," I said. That was the first operational instruction I had given him since his guilty plea. His eyes lifted to mine, but he did not mistake the moment for absolution. Later, while Sophie packed soil around the sapling, Nolan approached me again. "I know I don't deserve the old place back, no," I said. "You don't." He nodded. The answer hurt him, but I had learned that soft lies could damage a family as deeply as harsh ones. "I loved you," he said. "Even when I resented you, I loved you badly sometimes." He looked toward the empty slope. "Dad, too. Yes, we stood together in the cold. I can forgive the frightened son who wanted to prove himself," I said. "I cannot give authority back to the man who falsified those records. I understand forgiveness is not the restoration of power. I know, trust grows slower than pear trees." A faint smile moved across his face. "Then I have time to work. Mercer Ridge no longer belongs to our family in the way it once did." After the criminal case, I transferred the core orchard into an employee stewardship trust. No single family member can sell the land, water rights, or operating assets. Major decisions require employees, community representatives, and independent agricultural advisors. Nolan called that arrangement an admission that I no longer trusted my children. He was correct. It was also an admission that Daniel and I had made a mistake by confusing family ownership with permanent virtue. Land does not become safe because your name is on the deed. It becomes safe when no one person has enough power to poison it in secret. Sophie straightened beside the new tree. At the end of the row, Mateo adjusted a transparent section of irrigation pipe installed above ground. His maintenance company now held the orchard contract. Any visitor could watch clean water pass through the line before it reached the roots. Lena stood nearby with a sampling kit, still refusing to trust appearances. Claire carried a wooden sign toward us. She had carved the words herself. Together we set it beside the first tree. "What feeds a family must never poison it." The wind moved gently through the bare branches. I thought of Daniel, the lost camas trees, and the years our family would never recover. Justice had not returned what was taken. It had only stopped the taking. That had to be enough. Sophie slipped her hand into mine. The sapling bent in the wind, then lifted again. Its roots were small, but they were clean. And this time, we would all be watching the water. If this story reminds you of someone whose concern became control, trust what patterns reveal, not merely what people promise. And remember, protecting a family sometimes means changing the ground it stands on.